The illusory truth effect. If you hear something often enough, you'll start believing it, whether it's true or not. This is the core of the illusory truth effect. It's why propaganda works, why fake news spreads like wildfire, and why we tend to believe rumors even when we know they don't make sense. But why does this happen? The human brain is lazy when it comes to truth-checking. It takes effort to analyze every single thing we hear, so instead, we use shortcuts. One of these shortcuts is familiarity. If something feels familiar, because we've heard it multiple times, our brain assumes it must be true. This is how false ideas gain traction and how misinformation becomes widely accepted. Think about common misconceptions. Sugar makes kids hyperactive. Parents everywhere believe this, but studies show it's false. Yet, because it's repeated so often, people assume it's true. We only use 10% of our brains. A completely debunked myth, yet movies and self-help books have repeated it so often that many people still accept it as fact. Lightning never strikes the same place twice. It does, very often in fact. Yet, this false idea is repeated so frequently that it's accepted as truth. Advertising uses the illusory truth effect masterfully. You hear a slogan like, "Red Bull gives you wings," enough times, and even though you logically know Red Bull won't make you fly, your brain starts associating it with energy and alertness. Repetition in political campaigns is another huge example. If a candidate repeats a phrase like, "We are the strongest economy in history," over and over, people begin to accept it as fact, even if data says otherwise. A study in 1977 by researchers Lynn Hasher, David Goldstein, and Thomas Topino proved this effect in action. Participants were shown both true and false statements multiple times. The more they saw a statement, the more likely they were to rate it as true, even when they had no evidence to support it. More recent studies confirm this. Even when people know a statement is false, repeated exposure makes them feel like it's true. This feeling of familiarity is powerful because the brain values ease over accuracy. Now that you know how this trick works, how can you protect yourself from it? Question repeated statements. Just because you hear something often doesn't mean it's true. Look for evidence and ask yourself, where did this information come from? Is there real proof? Expose yourself to multiple viewpoints because if you only hear one side of a story, you'll be more likely to believe it, even if it's false. Be aware of emotional manipulation. The more an idea is repeated in an emotional way, the more likely it is to stick. Repetition is one of the most powerful psychological weapons, and it can work for good or bad. Now that you know about the illusory truth effect, you won't be so easily fooled. The Zeigarnik Effect. Have you ever started watching a TV show and found yourself obsessed with finishing it, even if you weren't that interested? That's the Zeigarnik Effect in action. This psychological trick explains why unfinished tasks stick in our minds more than completed ones. It's the reason cliffhangers keep us watching, why to-do lists create anxiety, and why we can't stop thinking about things we've left undone. TV cliffhangers are a perfect example. You finish an episode and suddenly it ends on a dramatic moment. You can't stop thinking about what will happen next. The show has hooked you. Unfinished arguments work the same way. Ever had a disagreement that didn't get resolved? You keep replaying it in your head, thinking about what you should have said. Incomplete work has the same effect. If you leave a task half done, your brain won't let it go. It will nag you until you finish it. Bluma Zeigarnik, a Russian psychologist, discovered this effect in the 1920s. She observed that waiters in a cafe could remember unpaid orders, but forgot orders as soon as they were settled. The unfinished nature of unpaid bills kept them fresh in their minds. Your brain sees unfinished tasks as incomplete puzzles. Just like an open loop, your mind wants to close it. This creates mental tension, which stays until the task is completed. Studies show that this tension increases focus and motivation, but only if we feel capable of finishing the task. If a task feels too overwhelming, it can lead to procrastination instead. Starting something, even if you don't finish it, can be an effective way to boost motivation. If you struggle with getting things done, just begin. The brain will naturally want to complete what it started. For studying, instead of cramming, stop mid-chapter. Your brain will feel the urge to remember and continue the next day. Sales and marketing use this effect all the time. Free trials, unfinished stories, and teaser ads all make you want more. If you tend to overthink, this effect can make you obsess over things you didn't finish. If you feel anxious, train your brain by writing down unfinished tasks. This helps give your brain closure without actually completing them. If you struggle with sleep, an incomplete task list can keep you awake. Try a brain dump before bed. Write everything down so your brain can relax. The Zeigarnik Effect is a powerful mental trick. It keeps people engaged, focused, and motivated, but it can also drive you crazy if you don't control it. Now that you know how it works, you can use it for productivity instead of stress. These two psychological tricks, the Illusory Truth Effect and the Zeigarnik Effect, shape how we think, remember, and behave. One makes us believe false information, while the other makes us obsess over unfinished tasks. Both can be used to your advantage, or they can manipulate you without you even realizing it. Now, you're one step ahead. Reverse psychology. Tell someone not to do something, and suddenly they want to do it even more. This is the foundation of reverse psychology, a mind trick so effective that parents, marketers, and even manipulators use it all the time. It plays on the natural human tendency to resist being controlled. People like to believe they are in charge of their own decisions. The moment they feel restricted, they instinctively push back against authority. This psychological reaction is called reactance, a mental rebellion against being told what to do. When someone says, "You can't do that," the brain interprets it as a challenge rather than a limitation. It happens everywhere. A teenager who was never interested in a party might suddenly feel an irresistible urge to go the moment a parent says, "You're not allowed to go." A customer might ignore an advertisement, but when the product is labeled as only for the most daring buyers, it suddenly becomes intriguing. A child who refuses to eat vegetables might take a bite just because the parent sighs and says, "Fine, I guess you're just not strong enough to eat carrots." The forbidden fruit effect is real. The scarcity principle amplifies it. If something is off limits, we assume it must be special or valuable. This is why people crave limited edition products or why a banned book suddenly skyrockets in popularity. Marketers use reverse psychology constantly. Some ads tell customers, "This deal is not for everyone," subtly implying that only smart or elite buyers will take advantage of it. Suddenly, people want in. Some websites show only 2 left in stock, triggering the instinct to grab it before it's too late. The fear of missing out, FOMO, kicks in, making the purchase feel urgent. Reverse psychology also appears in negotiation tactics. If someone is hesitant about a deal, the other party might say, "You're probably not interested," and that's fine. A statement that makes the hesitant person more eager to prove they are interested. Salespeople use this to push indecisive buyers into closing deals. One of the most powerful applications of reverse psychology is in leadership and persuasion. A manager might say, "I doubt anyone is brave enough to take on this challenge," and suddenly, employees step up to prove them wrong. Coaches often use it to push athletes. "You probably can't run another lap, can you?" which sparks the drive to prove otherwise. But there's a dark side. Manipulative individuals use reverse psychology to control others without appearing controlling. In toxic relationships, a person might say, "Fine, leave if you want," knowing that this statement will provoke guilt and make the other person stay. Some people use it to create artificial scarcity. making themselves seem unattainable to make others chase them. Recognizing reverse psychology, when it's used against you, is key to protecting your autonomy. When someone tells you not to do something, pause and ask yourself, am I making this choice because I truly want to, or because I feel pressured by the restriction? Taking a step back can help you break free from emotional manipulation and make clearer decisions. Reverse psychology is a powerful tool, but it works best when used subtly. The more obvious it is, the less effective it becomes. The key to making it work is to not sound like you're trying to control someone, because the moment they sense manipulation, it backfires. Anchoring bias. The first piece of information you hear in a conversation has more power over your decision than you think. This is anchoring bias, a mental shortcut where the brain clings to the first number, idea, or statement as a reference point, even if it's completely random. This trick is why salespeople start negotiations with a high price, even if they plan to lower it. It's why you feel like a $100 discount is a great deal, even if the original price was artificially inflated. And it's why your first impression of someone sticks, even if later evidence contradicts it. Anchoring bias works because the human brain doesn't process information in isolation. Instead, it compares new data to what it already knows. The first number or statement you hear becomes the foundation, and everything after that is judged relative to it. Imagine you walk into a store and see a jacket priced at $500, then another one at $150. The second jacket feels like a steal, but what if you had seen the $150 jacket first, followed by one priced at $50? Suddenly, the $150 jacket seems overpriced. The actual value hasn't changed, but your perception of it has, because of the anchor. Businesses use anchoring to frame decisions in their favor. Ever noticed how restaurants list an outrageously expensive dish at the top of the menu? Almost no one orders it, but it makes everything else look reasonably priced in comparison. Real estate agents show buyers overpriced houses first, so the next ones seem like bargains. Tech companies launch a premium version of a product first, so the regular version appears more affordable. Anchoring bias also affects salary negotiations. If a company offers you $40,000, your mind locks onto that number, even if you deserve more. But if you propose $60,000 first, the negotiation revolves around a higher starting point. The first number sets the stage. It even affects courtroom decisions. If a lawyer asks for an unusually high settlement, the final amount awarded is likely to be higher, even if it's lower than the original demand. Judges, juries, and negotiators all unconsciously lean toward the anchor. Anchoring bias can also distort perceptions of people. If someone is introduced as brilliant, you unconsciously look for signs of intelligence. If they're described as difficult, you filter their actions through that lens. First impressions stick because of anchoring. But it's not just external influences. People anchor their own beliefs too. If you've always thought of yourself as bad at math, that belief becomes an anchor. Even when you improve, your mind holds onto the old identity, making it harder to recognize progress. Avoiding anchoring bias requires deliberate thinking. Instead of accepting the first piece of information as fact, challenge it. When you see a discount, ask yourself, what was the original price, and was it fair? When negotiating, don't let the other person set the anchor. Set it yourself. Recognizing the power of anchoring can change how you make decisions. If you can control the first number or idea in a conversation, you control the entire frame of reference. And if you're aware of it when others try to anchor you, you'll be able to break free from its influence. The Ben Franklin Effect. It seems logical to assume that if you help someone, they will feel grateful and more inclined to return the favor. But strangely enough, psychology suggests the opposite. People who do a favor for you are actually more likely to help you again than those whom you help. This is known as the Ben Franklin Effect, a counterintuitive trick of the mind that rewires how we see others based on our own actions. The effect was named after Benjamin Franklin, who used it to turn an adversary into an ally. Franklin once had a political rival who openly disliked him. Instead of trying to win him over through favors or persuasion, Franklin asked this rival for a small favor. He requested to borrow a rare book from his collection. The rival, feeling flattered by the request, lent Franklin the book. When Franklin returned it with gratitude, the man's attitude toward him changed completely. He became friendly, and their relationship improved from then on. Franklin noted this phenomenon in his autobiography, realizing that once someone does something kind for you, they subconsciously justify it by thinking they must like you. This psychological trick works because of cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort people feel when their actions contradict their beliefs. If someone previously disliked you, but then does something nice for you, their brain struggles to reconcile the contradiction. Instead of admitting they were wrong, they adjust their beliefs to align with their actions. They tell themselves, I must like this person if I'm willing to help them. The Ben Franklin effect plays out in everyday life in subtle yet powerful ways. If you ask a coworker for help on a small task, they are more likely to assist you again in the future. If you get a neighbor to do you a minor favor, their likelihood of helping you again increases. The more they invest in assisting you, the more they rationalize that they must care about you. Conversely, this effect can explain why doing too many favors for others doesn't always make them like you more. If you constantly help someone, they might start to feel obligated or even resentful. But if they help you, their brain convinces them that they must value the relationship. This trick is widely used in social and business situations. Salespeople sometimes ask customers to perform a small action, like filling out a survey or giving feedback. Once a person invests effort, they become more open to continuing engagement. Politicians use it as well. A candidate might ask supporters to donate a tiny amount, knowing that those who give even a small sum are psychologically more likely to keep supporting them. To use the Ben Franklin effect to your advantage, start by requesting small favors from people you want to build a positive relationship with. It's a subtle but effective way to strengthen connections, and if you ever find yourself disliking someone, consider doing something nice for them. Your brain might just trick you into liking them more. The paradox of choice. More options should make decisions easier, right? It seems logical to think that having more choices means a greater likelihood of finding exactly what you want. But in reality, the opposite happens. The more options people have, the harder it becomes to choose, often leading to decision paralysis, regret, and dissatisfaction. This psychological phenomenon is known as the paradox of choice. At first glance, having many options feels empowering. Walking into a store with hundreds of cereal brands should mean you'll find the perfect one. A dating app with endless potential matches should increase the likelihood of finding an ideal partner. An online marketplace with thousands of products should ensure you get the best deal. But instead of feeling satisfied, people become overwhelmed. The problem arises because when faced with too many options, the brain struggles to process all the possible outcomes. Decision-making slows down, and instead of confidently choosing, people hesitate, overanalyze, or even avoid making a decision altogether. This is why people often take longer to pick a show on Netflix than to actually watch one. The sheer number of choices creates anxiety. What if they pick the wrong one? Psychologist Barry Schwartz, who popularized the paradox of choice, conducted experiments showing that when people were given fewer options, they were more likely to make a decision and feel happy with it. In one famous study, grocery store customers were presented with two displays of jam samples, one with 6 flavors and another with 24. While more people were drawn to the larger selection, the group that had fewer choices was 10 times more likely to actually buy a jar. This effect is everywhere. In the job market, People with too many career options often struggle to commit to a path, fearing they might miss out on something better. In relationships, dating apps give an illusion of unlimited possibilities, making people hesitant to settle down, always wondering if someone better is out there. Online shopping can lead to hours of scrolling, only for the buyer to regret their choice, thinking they might have missed out on a superior product. Choice paralysis doesn't just slow down decision-making, it also decreases satisfaction. When people finally choose, they tend to feel less happy because they second-guess themselves. If a restaurant has 10 dishes and you pick one, you might feel good about your choice. But if there are 100 dishes, you might constantly wonder if you picked the best one, leading to regret. Businesses and designers have learned to combat this problem by offering limited choices. High-end brands often reduce their product lines to avoid overwhelming customers. Streaming services curate top picks lists to narrow down choices. Productivity experts recommend limiting to-do lists to just a few tasks per day to reduce decision fatigue. One of the best ways to counteract the paradox of choice is to set clear criteria before choosing. If you know what you want in a job, a relationship, or a purchase, you can eliminate irrelevant options quickly instead of endlessly comparing. Another method is to give yourself a time limit to decide. When you reduce the time spent overanalyzing, you decrease anxiety and increase satisfaction. Having choices is good, up to a point, but when there are too many, it creates stress instead of freedom. By understanding the paradox of choice, you can make quicker, more confident decisions and actually enjoy what you choose. The door-in-the-face technique. If you ask for something outrageous and get rejected, then follow up with a much smaller request. The second request suddenly seems reasonable, even if it wouldn't have been accepted on its own. This is the door-in-the-face technique, a psychological trick that makes people more likely to agree to what you really want by first presenting them with an extreme ask. At first glance, it seems counterintuitive. Why would someone reject a big request but then agree to a smaller one right after? The answer lies in the subconscious need for compromise. When someone says no to a large request, they often feel guilty or uncomfortable, especially if the person asking seems sincere. When the smaller request follows, it feels like they are meeting in the middle, restoring a sense of fairness. This technique works because of a psychological principle called reciprocal concessions. When one party appears to back down, the other person feels a subtle obligation to do the same. The second request feels more reasonable, not necessarily because it is, but because it's being compared to the first one. Salespeople, negotiators, and fundraisers use this tactic all the time. Imagine a charity worker asking you to donate $500 to a cause. You decline because it's too much. Then they say, "Okay, how about just $20? Suddenly, $20 seems much more reasonable, even though you wouldn't have considered it if they had asked for it first. Retailers use this trick as well. A store might try to sell you an expensive bundle of products. When you hesitate, they say, "Okay, how about just buying this one item?" By contrast, the single item now feels affordable, even though you may not have planned to buy anything at all. Parents unknowingly use the door-in-the-face technique on their children. A parent might ask their child to clean the entire house. The child refuses. Then the parent says, "Okay, at least clean your room." The child, feeling like they've gotten out of the bigger chore, agrees, when they might not have if that was the first request. This technique can also work in negotiations. If an employee wants a raise of $5,000, they might start by asking for $10,000. When the employer declines, the employee compromises and asks for $5,000 instead, making it seem like a reasonable middle ground. But there's a limit to how extreme the first request can be. If it's too absurd, the person might feel manipulated and refuse everything. The best way to use the door-in-the-face technique is to make the first request big but not ridiculous. If the person sees the first ask as something you could genuinely want, the second request feels like a fair adjustment rather than a trick. Understanding this technique allows you to recognize when it's being used on you. Next time someone presents you with a massive request before scaling it down, ask yourself, would I have agreed to this second request if it was the first one I heard? If not, you're likely being influenced by the door-in-the-face technique. The foot-in-the-door technique. If you can get someone to say yes to a small request, they are far more likely to agree to a larger one later. This is the foot-in-the-door technique, a psychological trick based on the idea that once people commit to something small, they feel compelled to stay consistent with their actions. The effect happens because of a powerful force in human psychology, the need for consistency. People like to see themselves as rational and consistent in their decisions. Once they say yes to something minor, their brain starts forming an identity around that decision. When asked to do something bigger later, they feel an internal pressure to stay aligned with the commitment they already made. This technique is commonly used in sales, marketing, and even politics. A salesperson might ask, "Can I take just 5 minutes of your time?" If you agree, you've already said yes to engaging with them. Later, when they ask you to sign up for something, you're much more likely to comply because you've already invested in the interaction. Charities use this method effectively. If an organization asks you to sign a petition, you might think, sure, why not? But later, when they ask for a donation, you feel more inclined to give because you've already demonstrated support for their cause. Marketers use this strategy to hook consumers. A company might offer a free trial or a small freebie. Once a customer has engaged with the brand, they feel more comfortable making a purchase. Subscription services like Netflix and Amazon Prime take advantage of this by giving free trials. Once a user has invested time in the service, canceling becomes harder because it feels like a disruption to their routine. Social situations also reveal how the foot-in-the-door technique plays out. If a friend asks you for a small favor, like lending them a pen, you probably won't hesitate. But if they later ask for something bigger, like borrowing your car for a day, you're more likely to say yes than if they had asked outright. Your brain rationalizes, I already helped them before. I must be the kind of person who helps them. This technique is so effective that it has even been used in historical events. During the Korean War, American prisoners of war in Chinese camps were subtly manipulated using foot-in-the-door tactics. Instead of forcing them to adopt communist beliefs, captors first asked them to make tiny statements like, "The U.S. isn't perfect." Over time, these small admissions led some prisoners to willingly write pro-communist statements, believing they were doing so of their own free will. The foot-in-the-door technique is powerful, but it can be recognized and resisted. If you ever find yourself agreeing to something bigger than what you originally intended, ask yourself, would I have agreed to this if I hadn't already committed to something smaller? If not, you're likely being influenced by this psychological effect. Being aware of these techniques allows you to navigate situations more effectively. The door-in-the-face technique gets people to agree by making them feel like they're compromising, while the foot-in-the-door technique builds commitment gradually. Both are powerful tools of influence, whether you're the one using them or the one being influenced. The decoy effect. Sometimes, making a decision feels effortless. One option just seems better. But what if your brain was tricked into thinking that way? The decoy effect is a psychological strategy that influences decision-making by introducing a third, intentionally less attractive option, making one of the original two seem like the obvious choice. This effect is used everywhere, from pricing strategies in business to marketing tactics designed to nudge consumers toward a specific decision. To understand how it works, imagine you're at a movie theater. The menu offers 2 sizes of popcorn, a small for $3 and a large for $7. You might hesitate, Do you want to spend that much for a large one? Now imagine a third option appears, a medium for $6. Suddenly, the large popcorn seems like an incredible deal. It's just $1 more than the medium. Most people would now choose the large, even if they originally weren't planning to spend that much. The medium option was never meant to sell. It was there to push you toward the large. This works because of relative comparison. On its own, a $7 popcorn seems expensive, but when placed next to a $6 medium, the large no longer feels overpriced. It feels like a bargain. Your brain doesn't evaluate the options in isolation. It compares them to each other. The decoy creates an illusion of value, influencing you to pick the intended choice. Marketers and businesses use the decoy effect constantly. A tech company might offer 3 versions of a product: a basic model, a premium model, and a decoy model that is slightly worse but almost as expensive as the premium. The decoy makes the premium option look significantly better by comparison, pushing customers to spend more. This trick also appears in restaurant menus. A wine list might include 3 options: a cheap bottle, a mid-range bottle, and an expensive one. The mid-range option is often the one most people choose, but restaurants know that adding a slightly more expensive but clearly inferior bottle will make the mid-range wine seem like the best value. The decoy effect is even used in politics and negotiations. If a politician or company wants to make one proposal seem more appealing, they introduce a similar but slightly worse option. Suddenly, the one they wanted you to pick in the first place seems like the clear winner. The best way to avoid being manipulated by the decoy effect is to evaluate your choices independently rather than comparatively. Ask yourself, would I pick this option if the third one didn't exist? If the answer is no, you might be falling for this psychological trap. The scarcity principle. If something seems rare, exclusive, or about to run out, it instantly becomes more desirable. This is the scarcity principle, a psychological effect that makes people place higher value on things that are perceived to be in limited supply, whether it's a product, an opportunity, or even attention from another person. Scarcity makes it feel significantly more important. This effect is hardwired into human psychology. Throughout history, scarcity signaled survival. Resources like food and water were precious when rare, making humans instinctively prioritize them. Even though we now live in a world of abundance, the brain still reacts to perceived scarcity as if it's a life or death matter. Retailers use this trick constantly. Online stores display only 3 left in stock warnings, creating a sense of urgency. Limited time sales make people rush to buy things they might not have even wanted before. Black Friday is a perfect example. Products are available all year, but the fear of missing out, FOMO, during the sale causes a buying frenzy. Luxury brands have mastered the art of scarcity. High-end watches, handbags, and sneakers are often produced in small quantities, not because they can't make more, but because they know scarcity increases demand. People want what they can't easily have. When Apple releases a new iPhone and stock runs low, the anticipation skyrockets. People who wouldn't have rushed to buy it suddenly feel an overwhelming need to get one. The scarcity principle also applies in relationships and social settings. A person who is always available is often taken for granted, but someone who is selective with their time is perceived as more valuable. In dating, people who seem harder to get often appear more attractive, even if they aren't necessarily better partners. The feeling of potential loss makes them seem more desirable. Travel and hotel booking websites use this effect aggressively. Messages like, "Only one room left at this price," or "5 people are looking at this right now," create pressure. The same happens with airline tickets. where prices appear to fluctuate based on demand. In reality, these tactics are carefully designed to manufacture urgency. Psychologists have tested this principle in experiments. In one study, participants were given two identical jars of cookies, one full, one nearly empty. Even though the cookies were the same, people consistently rated the cookies in the near-empty jar as tasting better. The fact that there were fewer of them created the illusion of higher value. Scarcity also plays a role in decision-making. A job offer with limited spots available seems more prestigious. A social media post that disappears after 24 hours is more likely to be watched than one that remains available forever. Even information can be affected by this principle. Secret or restricted knowledge feels more valuable than something widely accessible. Recognizing the scarcity principle allows you to break free from unnecessary pressure. Ask yourself, do I really want this, or am I just reacting to the idea that I might lose it? If you take a step back, the urgency often fades, and you can make clearer decisions. Scarcity is a powerful illusion, but it only works if you let it. The next time something feels overwhelmingly desirable because it's rare, remember, just because something is hard to get doesn't mean it's worth having. Framing effect. The way information is presented can completely alter how people perceive and react to it. This is known as the framing effect, a powerful cognitive bias where the same piece of information leads to different decisions depending on whether it's framed positively or negatively. In short, it's not what you say, but how you say it that influences decision-making. Imagine you're about to undergo surgery. The doctor presents two different statistics. This procedure has a 90% survival rate. This procedure has a 10% fatality rate. The facts are identical, but the way they are framed changes how they feel. The first statement sounds reassuring, the second sounds risky. People are far more likely to proceed with surgery when they hear the 90% survival version rather than the 10% fatality version, even though both communicate the same reality. This effect is used everywhere, from politics to marketing to everyday conversations. News outlets frame stories to evoke specific emotions. A headline that reads, "Crime rate drops to 5% sounds positive, while 1 in 20 people are still victims of crime sounds concerning, even if both statements describe the same reality. Marketers rely on the framing effect to shape consumer behavior. A label that says 95% fat-free makes a product sound healthier than one that says 5% fat, even though they mean the same thing. Similarly, a store might advertise a 20% discount rather than saying you're paying 80% of the price. Both statements are mathematically identical, but the way they're presented affects how desirable the deal seems. In finance, the framing effect plays a major role in investment decisions. A stock market report that says the market gained 3% this month makes investors feel optimistic, while a report that says the market is still down 10% from last year might cause anxiety. Even though both statements can be true at the same time, the framing shifts emotional reactions. It also affects personal relationships. Consider how feedback is given. Telling someone, "You made a mistake, but you learned a lot," will encourage them to improve, while saying, "You failed at this," may discourage them. Parents, teachers, and managers can shape confidence and motivation simply by choosing whether to frame feedback in a positive or negative light. Politicians use framing all the time. Policies are branded as job creators instead of corporate tax breaks, or public safety measures instead of surveillance programs. The wording changes how people feel about an idea before they even consider the facts. The framing effect is particularly dangerous because it often works subconsciously. People think they're making rational choices, but in reality, Their decisions are swayed by the way information is presented. Recognizing this bias helps to counteract its influence. Next time you're faced with a decision, pause and ask yourself, is this the actual information, or am I reacting to the way it's framed? By stepping back, you regain control over how you interpret the facts rather than letting the framing dictate your emotions. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. You learn a new word, and suddenly you hear it everywhere. You buy a new car, and now you see the same model on the road constantly. You start researching a niche topic, and within days, it seems like the world is obsessed with it too. This is the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, also known as the frequency illusion, a trick your brain plays on you, making it feel like something has suddenly become more common when, in reality, you've just started noticing it more. This effect happens because the human brain is wired to recognize patterns. When you become aware of something new, your mind subconsciously starts filtering for it. It was always there, but now your selective attention is tuned to it. The world hasn't changed, your perception of it has. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon is a mix of selective attention and confirmation bias. Selective attention occurs when your brain starts unconsciously scanning for something relevant. If you just got interested in electric cars, your mind will now pick up on every Tesla or Prius you pass, even though they've always been around. Confirmation bias kicks in when your brain reinforces the idea that these things have suddenly become more frequent, even though they haven't. This phenomenon is why trends seem to explode overnight. If you start hearing a song on the radio, seeing it on social media, and overhearing people talk about it, it feels like the world is obsessed with it. In reality, it was likely already popular. You just weren't paying attention before. Marketers and advertisers exploit this effect by making products more visible across multiple platforms. If you see an ad for a new phone, then hear a coworker mention it, then see someone using it, you assume it must be everywhere. The reality is that your brain is now filtering for it, making it seem more prevalent than it really is. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon also plays a role in personal beliefs. If someone starts researching conspiracy theories, they suddenly see evidence of them everywhere. If someone believes a certain political narrative, they start noticing every news story that supports their viewpoint while ignoring contradictory ones. The effect reinforces biases by making it feel like the world is confirming your existing beliefs, when in fact, your brain is just filtering information selectively. This trick of perception can even influence relationships. If you develop a crush on someone, you might suddenly notice little details about them, how often they walk by, how frequently they mention similar interests. It might feel like fate, but in reality, you were just blind to these details before. Understanding the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon is important because it reminds us that what we notice isn't necessarily what has changed. Our awareness has changed. The next time you feel like something is everywhere all of a sudden, ask yourself, has the world changed, or has my attention shifted? This awareness helps separate coincidence from reality, preventing us from falling into the illusion that something is more common, important, or meaningful than it truly is. The halo effect. A person walks into a room, radiating confidence, dressed immaculately, with a warm, charismatic smile. Instantly, without knowing anything else about them, your mind starts filling in the blanks. You assume they must be intelligent, competent, kind, and even successful. This is the halo effect, a powerful psychological bias where one positive trait, such as physical attractiveness or confidence, influences how we perceive someone's other qualities, even if we have no real evidence. The halo effect explains why attractive people are often assumed to be smarter or more talented than they actually are. Studies have shown that individuals perceived as physically attractive are more likely to get hired, receive promotions, and even be given lighter sentences in court. When someone looks the part, our brains unconsciously assign them other positive characteristics. This effect is not just about physical appearance. A person who speaks eloquently is often assumed to be intelligent. A confident speaker in a meeting is seen as more competent than a quiet, hesitant one, even if their ideas are no better. A celebrity who does charity work is perceived as morally good, even though their private life might be a mess. Marketers use the halo effect to shape our perceptions of brands. If a luxury brand is associated with high-end fashion, people assume all their products must be top quality, even their accessories or fragrances, which might be no better than cheaper alternatives. If a car company produces one successful model, consumers assume their entire lineup must be equally reliable. The effect extends to education and leadership. Teachers tend to rate students they find pleasant or well-behaved as smarter than their peers, even if their test scores say otherwise. Leaders who are charismatic often gain trust more easily than those who are quieter, even if their decision-making skills are not superior. Once the halo effect is in place, it becomes self-reinforcing. When someone is perceived positively, people interpret their actions in a favorable light. If an admired celebrity makes a controversial statement, their fans are more likely to defend or rationalize it. If an attractive coworker makes a mistake, others might excuse it as an accident, whereas a less likable colleague might be criticized for the same error. To avoid falling into the halo effect, it's important to pause and ask, am I judging this person's abilities based on real evidence, or am I being influenced by one standout trait? Recognizing this bias allows you to see people more objectively rather than letting one positive characteristic shape your entire perception of them. The horn effect. The horn effect is the dark mirror of the halo effect. Instead of one positive trait making a person seem better than they are, one negative trait makes them seem far worse. This means that if someone makes a bad first impression, dresses poorly, or has an unlikable personality trait, our brains tend to assume everything else about them is negative, even when there's no real reason to think so. Imagine walking into a job interview. The interviewer notices that your shirt is wrinkled. Even though your skills and experience are strong, they might unconsciously assume you're careless or unprofessional. The horn effect is why people who speak with hesitation or lack confidence are often perceived as less competent, even if their ideas are great. This effect plays out in countless ways. If a student is disruptive in class, teachers may assume they're not intelligent, even if they perform well on exams. If a customer service employee has a slightly rude tone, the customer might assume the entire company has poor service. If a public figure is caught in one scandal, their entire career is often judged harshly, even if they had decades of positive contributions beforehand. The horn effect can also shape social and professional relationships. If someone is seen as unfriendly or awkward, people might assume they lack intelligence or competence, even if they are highly skilled. If an employee makes one mistake, their boss might see them as unreliable, even if they have a strong work history. It affects the way the media portrays individuals and events. If a news outlet presents someone in a negative light, people tend to accept that characterization without questioning whether there's more to the story. A politician caught in a single embarrassing moment might be branded as incompetent, even if their track record is otherwise strong. Just like the halo effect, the horn effect creates self-fulfilling prophecies. When someone is perceived negatively, others treat them with skepticism or hostility, which can lead them to act defensively or underperform, reinforcing the negative perception. A student unfairly labeled as lazy might stop trying in school because they feel judged. A misunderstood coworker might withdraw socially, further reinforcing the idea that they are unfriendly. To counteract the horn effect, it's important to recognize when we are judging someone too harshly based on a single negative trait. Instead of letting one bad impression cloud your judgment, Take a step back and ask, am I making assumptions about this person's character or abilities based on limited information? Separating perception from reality helps ensure that people are judged fairly rather than being defined by one mistake, flaw, or unfavorable characteristic. Both the halo effect and the horn effect show how first impressions and singular traits shape our overall perception of people. Understanding these biases allows us to make more rational judgments and ensures we don't unfairly elevate or diminish someone based on factors that might not truly reflect their abilities or character. The bystander effect. In moments of crisis, we like to believe that if someone needed help, people around them would step in. But in reality, the more people there are, the less likely anyone is to take action. This is the bystander effect, a psychological phenomenon where individuals are less likely to help in an emergency if others are present, simply because they assume someone else will. This effect was famously demonstrated in the tragic case of Kitty Genovese in 1964. She was attacked outside her apartment in New York City, and although dozens of people reportedly saw or heard what was happening, no one intervened in time. When asked why they didn't help, many bystanders assumed that someone else would. This case led to research into what prevents people from taking action when help is needed. The bystander effect happens because of diffusion of responsibility. The more people there are, the less responsibility any single person feels to act. If you were the only witness to an accident, you'd likely feel compelled to help. But if a large crowd is watching, your brain assumes someone else is more qualified or responsible, and as a result, no one does anything. Another reason for this effect is social influence. People look to others for cues on how to behave. If no one else seems alarmed, individuals hesitate, assuming there's no real emergency. This hesitation creates a cycle, each person waiting for someone else to act, and in the process, no one moves. This effect is common in group settings, from workplace harassment to public altercations. If an employee is being mistreated, coworkers may hesitate to speak up, assuming someone else will. In public conflicts, onlookers often freeze because no one wants to be the first to intervene. Even in something as simple as littering, if people see trash on the ground but no one picking it up, they assume it's not their responsibility. Overcoming the bystander effect requires breaking this mental barrier. If you're in an emergency and need help, single out one person instead of appealing to the group. Instead of shouting, "Somebody call an ambulance," point directly at someone and say, "You call an ambulance." This eliminates diffusion of responsibility and forces a specific individual to take action. If you're a bystander, remind yourself that just because others aren't helping doesn't mean you shouldn't. Taking the first step can create a ripple effect. Once one person acts, others are far more likely to follow. The key to breaking the bystander effect is not assuming someone else will step up, because everyone else is thinking the same thing. Social proof. People don't like to be the first to do something, but if they see others doing it, suddenly it feels safe, acceptable, and even desirable. This is social proof, a psychological phenomenon where people tend to follow the actions of the crowd, especially when they're unsure of what to do. This effect explains why laughter tracks in sitcoms make jokes seem funnier, why long lines outside restaurants make them appear better, and why viral trends explode seemingly overnight. When people are uncertain, they look to others for guidance, assuming that if a lot of people are doing something, it must be the right thing to do. Marketers and businesses use social proof to influence consumer behavior. If you visit a website and see over 1 million customers have bought this product, it instantly makes the item seem more valuable. Customer reviews, testimonials, and influencer endorsements all tap into this principle. People are more likely to trust a product if they see that others have already approved of it. Social proof isn't just about purchases. It shapes opinions, behaviors, and even moral judgments. If you enter a new workplace and see that no one speaks up in meetings, you'll likely follow that behavior, assuming it's the norm. If you see a group of people looking up at the sky, you'll probably look up too, just to see what they're looking at. The desire to conform is deeply embedded in human psychology. This effect becomes even stronger in uncertain situations. When people don't know what to do, they mimic those around them. If a fire alarm goes off and no one reacts, others assume it's a false alarm. But if one person runs for the exit, the entire crowd follows. Social proof can also be used for manipulation. Fake reviews, bot-generated comments, and staged popularity can make something seem more successful than it really is. Some businesses pay for fake lines outside their stores to create the illusion of high demand. Political campaigns use mass rallies to generate the appearance of widespread support. The more people see others engaged, the more they believe they should be too. While social proof can be useful, it helps people make decisions efficiently. It's important to recognize when you're being influenced. Ask yourself, am I doing this because I truly want to, or just because I see others doing it? Being aware of social proof allows you to make decisions based on logic rather than just following the crowd. Both the bystander effect and social proof show how deeply group behavior influences individual decisions. One causes inaction, the other drives conformity. Understanding these effects allows you to break free from automatic reactions and make decisions that align with your own judgment rather than just going along with the group. The mere exposure effect. Familiarity breeds comfort. The more we see, hear, or experience something, the more we tend to like it, even if we were indifferent or skeptical at first. This is the mere exposure effect, a psychological phenomenon where repeated exposure to something increases our preference for it. It's why songs that initially seemed average start to sound good after multiple listens, why certain brands feel more trustworthy simply because we see them often, and why even faces of strangers start to seem friendlier over time. This effect was first studied by psychologist Robert Zeigarnik in the 1960s. He conducted experiments showing that when people were repeatedly exposed to unfamiliar stimuli, such as nonsense words, geometric shapes, or even random faces, they began to like them more just because they had seen them multiple times. The key takeaway? Familiarity creates preference, even when there's no logical reason for it. Marketers and advertisers use this effect extensively. This is why companies flood consumers with advertisements. Seeing the same brand again and again makes it feel more familiar and, therefore, more likable. Political campaigns operate the same way. A candidate's name or slogan, if repeated enough, starts to seem more acceptable, even to people who were initially indifferent. The mere exposure effect influences our social lives as well. People tend to like others more simply because they see them often. This explains why co-workers or classmates we initially had no strong feelings about start to feel like friends over time. The more we interact with someone, the more our brain categorizes them as safe and familiar, increasing our natural affinity for them. This effect even shapes romantic attraction. Studies have shown that proximity plays a major role in relationships. People are more likely to form bonds with those they encounter frequently, whether it's someone they see at work, the gym, or even on social media. The repeated exposure builds a sense of connection, even if there was no initial attraction. But the mere exposure effect has a limit. If overexposure happens too quickly or aggressively, it can backfire and lead to boredom or annoyance. This is why catchy songs that play everywhere can become irritating, why overplayed ads start feeling intrusive, and why someone texting too frequently can come across as clingy rather than endearing. Understanding this effect can help us shape our own habits. If you're trying to develop a taste for something, Whether it's a new hobby, a genre of music, or even a healthy food, you don't have to force yourself to love it instantly. Exposure alone can shift your preferences over time. On the flip side, if you're being influenced by repetitive messaging, take a step back and ask, do I actually like this, or do I just feel familiar with it? Cognitive dissonance. People like to believe they are logical and consistent in their thoughts and actions, but when reality contradicts their beliefs, an uncomfortable tension arises. This is cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that happens when we hold two conflicting ideas at the same time, or when our actions contradict our values. To reduce this discomfort, the brain works to resolve the conflict, often by changing our beliefs or justifying our behavior in ways that might not be entirely rational. Imagine a smoker who knows smoking is bad for their health. This knowledge contradicts their actions, creating cognitive dissonance. To resolve this, they might tell themselves, lots of people smoke and live long lives, or I only smoke socially, so it's not that bad. Instead of changing the habit, they adjust their thinking to reduce the conflict. This effect happens constantly in daily life. If someone spends a lot of money on an expensive but disappointing purchase, they might convince themselves that it was a great investment rather than admitting they wasted money. If a person stays in a bad relationship, they might justify it by saying, "We've been together for so long, it would be wrong to leave now," even if they are unhappy. Their brain rewrites the narrative to maintain psychological comfort. Cognitive dissonance is especially strong when people's identity is at stake. If someone believes they are a generous person but refuses to donate to charity, they might downplay the importance of generosity or find reasons why that specific charity doesn't deserve their help. Their mind works to defend their self-image, even if it means bending reality. This principle also explains why changing deeply held beliefs is so difficult. When people encounter evidence that contradicts their worldview, their brain often rejects it rather than accept the uncomfortable truth. A person who strongly believes in a conspiracy theory, for example, won't abandon it just because they see contradictory facts. Instead, they might say, "That's just what they want us to think." Their mind protects them from the psychological discomfort of admitting they were wrong. Marketers, politicians, and cult leaders all exploit cognitive dissonance. If someone is persuaded to take a small action, like signing a petition or trying a product for free, they start to see themselves as someone who supports that cause or brand. Later, when they're asked to donate money or make a purchase, they're more likely to comply to stay consistent with their previous actions. The key to overcoming cognitive dissonance is self-awareness. When you feel defensive or uncomfortable about a decision, ask yourself, am I justifying this because I truly believe it, or because I don't want to feel wrong? The ability to recognize and challenge cognitive dissonance leads to more honest thinking and smarter decision-making. Both the mere exposure effect and cognitive dissonance reveal how subtle forces shape our thoughts and behaviors. One makes us like things simply because we encounter them frequently. The other pushes us to justify choices even when they conflict with logic. Understanding these effects can help us become more mindful of why we believe what we believe, and when it might be time to reevaluate our thinking. The Pygmalion Effect. Expectations shape reality. When people are expected to perform well, they often rise to meet those expectations, even if they wouldn't have otherwise. This is the Pygmalion Effect, a psychological phenomenon where high expectations from others lead to better performance, increased motivation, and greater success. Named after the myth of Pygmalion, a sculptor who created a statue so beautiful that it came to life, this effect highlights the power of belief. When a teacher believes a student is gifted, when a coach believes an athlete is talented, or when a boss believes an employee has great potential, their belief alone can enhance performance. The individual starts to internalize these high expectations and puts in more effort, leading to better results. One of the most famous studies on the Pygmalion effect was conducted in 1968 by psychologists Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson. They told teachers that certain students in their class had been identified as academic bloomers, who were expected to show exceptional progress, though in reality, these students were chosen randomly. By the end of the school year, the students labeled as high potential performed significantly better than their peers. The only difference? Their teachers believed in them. This belief subtly influenced how the teachers interacted with these students, offering them more encouragement, attention, and challenges, all of which helped them excel. The Pygmalion effect is not limited to education. It exists in the workplace as well. When managers have high expectations for their employees, those employees tend to perform better, take on greater responsibility, and develop stronger skills. Leaders who show faith in their team create a cycle of growth. Employees work harder because they feel valued, and as a result, their actual capabilities improve. Even in personal relationships, this effect is at play. If a parent consistently tells a child that they are capable and intelligent, the child is more likely to believe it and act accordingly. If a friend constantly encourages another in their goals, that encouragement increases confidence and motivation. The way people perceive us has a direct impact on how we perceive ourselves. The power of expectation can also be self-directed. If you set higher expectations for yourself, you are more likely to push beyond limitations. Believing that you are capable of learning a new skill, achieving a goal, or handling a challenge changes the way you approach it. Instead of hesitating, you act with conviction, which increases the likelihood of success. Understanding the Pygmalion effect allows you to harness it in your own life. If you want to improve someone's performance, whether it's an employee, student, friend, or even yourself, set high but realistic expectations and express genuine belief in their potential. When people feel that someone believes in them, they become more motivated to live up to that belief. The Golem Effect. Just as high expectations improve performance, low expectations can sabotage it. The Golem Effect is the dark counterpart of the Pygmalion Effect. When people are expected to perform poorly, they often do. This is because low expectations reduce confidence, limit effort, and create self-fulfilling prophecies of failure. The name comes from the mythical golem, a creature shaped from clay that symbolizes brute force and mindless obedience. In the psychological sense, the Golem Effect refers to how negative expectations shape outcomes, dragging down performance and reinforcing failure. This effect has been demonstrated in numerous studies. In education, when teachers believe certain students are less capable, they often give them less attention, fewer opportunities to excel, and lower levels of encouragement. As a result, those students become less engaged and perform worse, not because they are naturally less capable, but because they were expected to fail. In the workplace, the same pattern emerges. Employees who sense that their boss doubts their abilities are more likely to underperform, hesitate in decision-making, and avoid challenges. Even if they are fully capable, the belief that they are not good enough affects their confidence and work ethic. A manager's skepticism, whether intentional or not, translates into subtle cues: less eye contact, fewer opportunities, or a lack of constructive feedback, all of which make the employee feel inadequate and unmotivated. Social relationships are also affected by the Golem Effect. If a child is constantly told they are not smart enough or not athletic enough, they may start believing it and stop trying. If a person is repeatedly made to feel incompetent by friends, family, or a romantic partner, their self-esteem takes a hit, making it harder for them to succeed in areas where they otherwise could have thrived. What makes the Golem Effect particularly dangerous is that it often goes unnoticed. Unlike outright criticism, Low expectations can be subtle: a lack of trust, an absence of encouragement, or even the tone in which someone is spoken to. Over time, the person receiving these signals internalizes the belief that they are not capable, leading to reduced effort and, ultimately, the very failure that was predicted. Breaking free from the Golem Effect requires conscious intervention. If you realize you're being subjected to low expectations, whether at work, in school, or in personal life, you have to mentally reject those limitations. Self-awareness is key. Ask yourself, am I really incapable, or have I just absorbed someone else's doubt? Surrounding yourself with people who believe in your potential can counteract the negative effects of low expectations. For leaders, teachers, and mentors, the lesson is clear. Be mindful of the expectations you set for others. Even if someone struggles at first, reinforcing belief in their ability to improve makes a huge difference. By avoiding negative labels and encouraging effort rather than focusing on shortcomings, you can prevent the Golem Effect from taking hold. Both the Pygmalion Effect and the Golem Effect prove that expectations are powerful enough to shape reality. One pushes people to excel, while the other holds them back. The key to success, whether for yourself or others, is to set expectations that inspire growth rather than reinforce failure. The Spotlight Effect. People tend to believe they are the center of attention, assuming that others notice their every flaw, mistake, or awkward moment. But in reality, most people are too focused on themselves to pay much attention to you. This is the Spotlight Effect, a psychological phenomenon where individuals overestimate how much others notice their actions, appearance, or mistakes. Imagine you spill coffee on your shirt before a big meeting. You walk in, convinced that everyone is staring at the stain and silently judging you. But the truth is, most people don't notice at all, or if they do, they quickly forget about it. While it might feel like a major embarrassment to you, it's barely a blip on anyone else's radar. This effect was confirmed in a famous study by psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky. They asked participants to wear an embarrassing t-shirt featuring a picture of Barry Manilow and estimated how many people in a room noticed it. Participants believed that everyone had noticed their shirt, but in reality, only a fraction of people even paid attention. This experiment revealed a core truth. We believe others are watching and judging us far more than they actually are. The spotlight effect occurs because of egocentrism. People view the world from their own perspective and assume others are as focused on them as they are on themselves. But in social situations, everyone is caught up in their own thoughts, worries, and insecurities. They are too busy thinking about themselves to obsess over what you did or didn't do. This effect fuels social anxiety, making people hesitate to speak up, dance in public, or wear something bold. They fear being judged, even though most people won't remember their actions a few minutes later. It also applies to past mistakes. Many people dwell on embarrassing moments from years ago, believing others still remember them. The reality? No one does. Understanding the spotlight effect can be liberating. It means you can take more risks, express yourself, and stop overanalyzing small mistakes. The next time you feel self-conscious, remind yourself, most people are not paying attention to you, and those who do will forget quickly. Once you stop worrying about what others think, you free yourself to live with more confidence and ease. The Pratfall Effect. Making a small, harmless mistake can actually make people like you more. This is the Pratfall Effect, a psychological phenomenon where someone who appears competent becomes more relatable, likable, and even charming when they show a small flaw. This effect was first studied by psychologist Elliot Aronson, who conducted an experiment in which participants listened to recordings of two people answering trivia questions. One person answered almost everything correctly, while the other made a few mistakes. In some versions of the experiment, the near-perfect participant spilled coffee on themselves toward the end of the recording. The result? People liked them more after the mistake, seeing them as more human and approachable. This effect happens because perfection is intimidating. People admire competence, but when someone appears flawless, they seem distant and unrelatable. A small mistake or moment of clumsiness breaks that wall, making the person more real. This is why celebrities who laugh at themselves or admit to awkward moments are often adored, while those who try too hard to maintain a perfect image can come off as unlikable or artificial. The Pratfall Effect is why a leader who forgets their speech for a second and laughs it off is often seen as more engaging than one who delivers everything perfectly but coldly. It's why job candidates who acknowledge a minor flaw in an interview while still being confident can seem more genuine and likable. In dating, people who show small imperfections, like telling a goofy story or making a minor blunder, tend to be more attractive than those who try to present themselves as flawless. However, this effect only works if the person is already perceived as competent. If someone who is struggling in their role makes a mistake, it reinforces negative perceptions rather than increasing likability. The key is balance, being good at what you do, while also being comfortable enough to laugh at yourself and show that you're human. The takeaway? Don't be afraid to be imperfect. A small mistake doesn't ruin your image. It can actually strengthen it. Embracing the Pratfall Effect means allowing yourself to be authentic, knowing that a little clumsiness or self-deprecating humor can make you more endearing. Instead of fearing small blunders, own them because they make you more real and, in turn, more likable. The FOMO Effect, fear of missing out. There's a party happening without you. Your friends are on vacation while you're at home. A new trend is taking off and you haven't joined in yet. That creeping anxiety you feel, that's FOMO, fear of missing out. The psychological effect that makes people feel uneasy, restless, and even impulsive when they believe others are experiencing something valuable that they are not. FOMO is one of the strongest motivators of human behavior. It is why people refresh social media obsessively, why they impulsively buy products because everyone else has them, and why they say yes to plans even when they'd rather stay home. The fear that others are gaining experiences, status, or advantages that they are missing out on creates a sense of urgency, a feeling that if they don't act now, they will be left behind. Social media amplifies FOMO massively. Platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter constantly show carefully curated highlights of other people's lives, vacations, parties, successes, new purchases. Even though logic tells us that people only post their best moments, the emotional response is different. It creates the illusion that everyone is living a better life than you. Marketers exploit FOMO relentlessly. Sales tactics like limited time offer, only 2 left in stock, and join 1,000 plus others who have already signed up trigger a sense of scarcity and urgency. The thought of missing an opportunity makes people buy impulsively, even if they don't need the product. Cryptocurrency and stock trading play on FOMO as well. People rush to invest in rising assets, not necessarily because they understand them, but because they fear being left out of potential profits. The psychological root of FOMO is tied to social belonging. Humans are wired to stay connected to the group for survival. In ancient times, missing out on a hunt, a social gathering, or shared resources could mean starvation or isolation. Today, the stakes aren't the same, but the instinct remains. The thought of others gaining experiences without us activates primal anxiety, even if those experiences are trivial. FOMO can lead to stress, burnout, and decision fatigue. When people say yes to everything just to avoid missing out, they overcommit and stretch themselves thin. It also creates dissatisfaction. People in the grip of FOMO aren't enjoying their own experiences because they are constantly thinking about the ones they aren't having. The antidote to FOMO is JOMO, the joy of missing out. Instead of worrying about what others are doing, JOMO means embracing the value of your own choices. The best way to counteract FOMO is to remind yourself that missing out is inevitable. There will always be events, opportunities, and trends you won't participate in. Instead of chasing every experience, focus on the ones that genuinely matter to you. Ask yourself, do I really want to do this, or am I just afraid of missing out? If it's the latter, stepping back and making intentional choices will bring far more peace than constantly chasing what others are doing. The Hedonic Treadmill. You get a promotion, a new car, or a dream vacation. At first you feel ecstatic, but after a while, the excitement fades, and you go back to feeling normal. The same happens with negative experiences. You go through a breakup, lose a job, or face disappointment, but after some time, your mood stabilizes. This is the hedonic treadmill, the idea that people, regardless of positive or negative life events, return to a baseline level of happiness over time. The reason it's called a treadmill is because no matter how much progress you seem to make in life, your happiness levels tend to stay in the same range. People think that if they reach a certain milestone, getting rich, finding the perfect partner, or achieving a lifelong goal, they will finally be permanently happy. But after the initial thrill wears off, they find themselves back where they started, wanting more. This effect was proven through research on lottery winners and accident survivors. Studies showed that people who won the lottery experienced a temporary spike in happiness, but within a year, they returned to their original mood. Similarly, people who suffered life-altering accidents and became paralyzed initially experienced a drop in happiness, but most of them adapted and returned to near-normal emotional states over time. The hedonic treadmill is fueled by adaptation. When something new and exciting happens, the brain quickly adjusts and begins to take it for granted. This is why material possessions lose their appeal over time, why raises at work feel exciting for only a short while, and why people in long-term relationships stop feeling the same intensity of passion they did at the beginning. Consumerism thrives on this effect. Advertisers sell the idea that the next purchase will finally make you happy, the newest phone, the bigger house, the fancier car. But because happiness always resets, people stay in a constant cycle of wanting more, believing they will eventually reach a lasting state of satisfaction. On the flip side, this effect also explains resilience. Even after negative life events, people gradually return to their emotional baseline. Heartbreaks, failures, and disappointments feel devastating at first, but as time passes, they lose their emotional weight. The human mind is incredibly adaptive, meaning that neither extreme highs nor extreme lows last forever. So, if happiness is always resetting, how do you break free from the hedonic treadmill? The key is appreciation over accumulation. Studies show that gratitude, actively recognizing and appreciating what you already have, can slow down adaptation and extend the feeling of happiness. Instead of constantly chasing the next thing, focusing on the present moment allows for deeper satisfaction. Happiness is not found in external achievements alone. It is built in perspective and mindset. If you can enjoy what you have right now, rather than waiting for some future milestone to complete you, you step off the treadmill and into real, lasting contentment. Loss aversion. Losing $100 hurts more than winning $100 feels good. This is the core of loss aversion, a psychological principle that explains why people are more motivated to avoid losses than to achieve gains. Even when the potential rewards are equal, The pain of losing is felt more intensely than the pleasure of winning. This effect was first studied by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who found that people are naturally risk-averse when it comes to potential losses. Their research showed that losing something valuable feels about twice as powerful as the joy of gaining something of the same value. This is why gamblers feel the sting of a loss far more than the excitement of a win, and why investors often hesitate to sell losing stocks, hoping they will recover rather than accepting the loss. Loss aversion is a major driver of irrational decision-making. People will go to great lengths to avoid losing something, even when it would be smarter to cut their losses. A common example is the sunk cost fallacy. When people continue investing in something, a failing business, a bad relationship, or a boring book, simply because they've already put time or money into it. The idea of losing what they've already invested overrides logic, even if quitting would be the better option. Marketers exploit loss aversion to influence consumer behavior. Free trials are a prime example. Once someone has used a product for free, they feel like they own it, and the idea of losing access makes them more likely to pay for it. Limited time offers also trigger loss aversion. Only 3 left in stock, or sale ends at midnight, make customers rush to buy, not because they need the product, but because they fear missing out. This effect extends to everyday life. Employees might stay in unsatisfying jobs longer than they should because quitting feels like losing security. Athletes refuse to retire even when their performance declines because they fear losing their identity. Even in relationships, people sometimes stay in unhappy situations simply because they fear losing what they've already built. The key to overcoming loss aversion is to reframe losses as opportunities. Instead of thinking, "I can't afford to lose this," ask, "What do I gain by letting go?" Realizing that losses are often just transitions to something better can prevent fear from controlling decisions. Understanding that the pain of loss is psychologically exaggerated can help people make smarter, more rational choices. The Endowment Effect. Have you ever tried selling something you own only to feel like others aren't offering enough? That's the Endowment Effect, a cognitive bias where people overvalue things simply because they own them. Whether it's an old car, a piece of furniture, or even an idea, people tend to believe their possessions are worth more than they actually are, just because they belong to them. This effect was first studied by Richard Thaler, who found that when people were given an object, like a coffee mug, and later asked to sell it, they demanded more money than they were willing to pay for the exact same mug if they didn't own it. Ownership creates an emotional attachment, making people assign greater value to something than it deserves in an objective market. The Endowment Effect explains why people often struggle to get rid of clutter. Those old clothes, books, or gadgets that sit unused in closets, even if they no longer serve a purpose, parting with them feels like a loss, even when logically it makes no difference. This bias also affects pricing and negotiations. Sellers often ask for more than buyers are willing to pay because they see their possessions as uniquely valuable. This is why people selling used cars, houses, or personal belongings often feel insulted by low offers, even when the market value justifies them. Marketers and companies exploit the Endowment Effect to increase customer loyalty. Free trials, test drives, and try-before-you-buy strategies work because once people experience ownership, even temporarily, they feel like the product is already theirs, making it harder to give up. Online shopping platforms use free returns as a strategy, knowing that once customers take an item home, they are less likely to return it because they have mentally attached to it. This effect extends beyond material possessions. People overvalue their own ideas, projects, and opinions making them resistant to change. In the workplace, someone who has worked hard on a project may reject valid criticism, simply because they feel personally attached to it. In debates, people hold on to their beliefs even when faced with clear evidence, because changing their mind feels like losing something personal. To counteract the endowment effect, it helps to detach from ownership and ask, if this wasn't mine, how much would I value it? This shift in perspective allows for better decision-making, whether it's selling something, decluttering, or even reconsidering long-held beliefs. Both loss aversion and the endowment effect reveal how people's emotional connection to possessions and past investments can distort rational thinking. By recognizing these biases, you can make clearer, less emotionally driven decisions about what's truly worth keeping and what's simply weighing you down. The Dunning-Kruger Effect. Have you ever met someone who is shockingly bad at something but completely convinced they're amazing? Or, on the flip side, someone who is brilliant but constantly doubts their abilities? This is the Dunning-Kruger Effect, a psychological phenomenon where incompetent people overestimate their abilities while highly skilled individuals tend to underestimate themselves. The effect was first studied by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger in 1999. Their research showed that people with low competence often lack the self-awareness to recognize their shortcomings. Because they don't fully understand the subject or skill, they don't realize how much they don't know, leading them to overestimate their expertise. Meanwhile, truly skilled individuals have a deep understanding of the subject, making them aware of how much there is still to learn, which leads them to undervalue their abilities. This explains why some of the most confident people are often the least competent. They mistake surface-level knowledge for mastery and assume they are experts after just a little exposure. It's why some people think they can coach a professional sports team after watching a few games, or why someone who skimmed an article suddenly believes they understand complex issues like politics or medicine. On the other hand, highly competent people assume that if something is easy for them, it must be easy for everyone else. They downplay their expertise, thinking, if I can do this, it's probably not that impressive. This is why some of the smartest and most talented individuals struggle with self-doubt and imposter syndrome. The Dunning-Kruger effect can be seen everywhere, from workplaces to politics to social media. People with limited knowledge often speak with absolute certainty, while experts hesitate because they understand the complexities of the topic. This effect is also why some people reject expert advice. They assume they know just as much as professionals in fields they've barely studied. This effect can be dangerous. Overconfident but incompetent individuals can make poor decisions, mislead others, and rise to leadership positions despite lacking the necessary skills. Meanwhile, truly knowledgeable people may hold back, doubting themselves or failing to assert their expertise. The best way to counteract the Dunning-Kruger effect is through self-awareness and continuous learning. If you find yourself absolutely certain about a topic, ask, how much do I actually know? Have I deeply studied this, or am I making assumptions? Likewise, if you're skilled at something but struggle with confidence, recognize that your self-doubt is likely a sign of true competence. The most intelligent people never stop learning, and that's precisely what makes them wise. The false consensus effect. Have you ever assumed that most people think like you do, only to be shocked when you realize they don't? That's the false consensus effect, a cognitive bias where people overestimate how much others share their beliefs, opinions, and behaviors. Humans naturally assume their way of thinking is normal and widely accepted. If you love a certain type of music, you might assume most people do. If you hold strong political beliefs, you likely think most reasonable people agree with you. If you find a joke funny, you might be surprised when others don't. This is because the brain uses itself as the default reference point. We assume that what seems obvious to us must also be obvious to others. The false consensus effect happens because people spend most of their time around like-minded individuals. Social circles, online communities, and workplaces often reinforce the same views. If everyone in your friend group holds a certain opinion, it's easy to believe that's the majority opinion, even if it's actually a minority view in the larger population. This effect distorts perception in several ways. It can lead to social misunderstandings, where people assume others think like them when they don't. It also fuels political and ideological divides. People believe their views are more popular than they actually are, making them more resistant to opposing perspectives. This is why social media can create echo chambers. Platforms show people content that aligns with their beliefs, reinforcing the illusion that everyone agrees with them. The false consensus effect also affects decision-making. Business leaders might assume customers want a certain product because they do. Politicians might overestimate public support for a policy because their close advisors support it. Employers might believe employees are satisfied with workplace conditions simply because no one speaks up, when in reality, many people feel differently but remain silent. One of the most surprising aspects of this bias is that it extends beyond opinions. It also affects moral judgments. Studies show that people assume others would make the same choices they would in ethical dilemmas. If someone thinks stealing is unacceptable, they assume most people feel the same way. If someone would cheat in a specific situation, they assume others would too. This can lead to misjudging others and misinterpreting their actions. To counteract the false consensus effect, it's important to actively seek out different perspectives. Ask yourself, is my belief actually widespread, or am I just surrounded by people who think like me? Engaging with diverse viewpoints helps correct this bias and leads to a more accurate understanding of the world. Both the Dunning-Kruger effect and the false consensus effect show how people misjudge their own knowledge and how they relate to others. One makes people overconfident in their abilities, while the other makes them overconfident in their beliefs' popularity. Recognizing these biases helps foster humility, curiosity, and open-mindedness, key traits for both personal growth and better decision-making. The just world hypothesis. People like to believe that the world is fair, that good people are rewarded and bad people are punished. This is the just world hypothesis, a cognitive bias that leads individuals to assume that others get what they deserve and that life operates on a system of fairness and justice. While this belief can be comforting, it often leads to misjudgment, victim blaming, and unrealistic expectations about how life actually works. This bias is deeply ingrained in human thinking because it gives people a sense of order and control. If the world is fair, then success must come from hard work, and failure must result from laziness or bad choices. It allows people to believe that as long as they do the right things, they will be safe from harm and misfortune. However, reality doesn't always work that way. Bad things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people. Yet, because the just world hypothesis makes people uncomfortable with this idea, they often try to rationalize unfair situations by assuming the victim must have done something to deserve it. This leads to victim blaming. When someone loses their job, people might assume they probably weren't working hard enough. If a person is scammed, others might believe they should have been more careful. When a person is assaulted, some may ask what they were wearing or why they were in that place, as if their actions brought it upon themselves. These rationalizations help people avoid the unsettling truth that misfortune can strike anyone, including themselves. By believing that bad things only happen to those who deserve it, people protect themselves from the anxiety that they too could suffer unjustly. The just world hypothesis also distorts perceptions of success. People often assume that wealthy or successful individuals must have worked harder or been more deserving than those who struggle. This leads to the false belief that poor people must be lazy or incompetent, when in reality, economic success is influenced by privilege, luck, and systemic factors as much as personal effort. This bias affects political and social attitudes. Those who strongly believe in a just world are less likely to support welfare programs, social justice movements, or policies that help the disadvantaged, because they assume people's situations are entirely the result of their own actions. To counteract the just world hypothesis, it's important to recognize that life is not always fair and that people's circumstances are influenced by factors beyond their control. Instead of assuming someone deserved their fate, a better approach is to ask what external factors might have contributed to this outcome. Adopting a more nuanced perspective helps develop empathy, fairness, and a more realistic understanding of the world. The placebo effect. Believing something will work can actually make it work, even if it has no real effect. This is the placebo effect, a powerful psychological phenomenon where expectations alone can trigger real physical or mental improvements. The classic example of this effect comes from medicine. Patients given a sugar pill with no actual drug in it often experience real relief from pain, anxiety, or other symptoms simply because they believe they are receiving actual treatment. Their belief activates the brain's natural ability to heal, releasing endorphins, reducing stress, and even changing physiological responses. Studies show that placebos can be as effective as actual medication in treating conditions like chronic pain, depression, and even some neurological disorders. In some cases, patients who take a placebo for weeks experience lasting health improvements despite receiving no active ingredient. The placebo effect isn't just limited to medicine. It works in fitness and performance, where athletes who believe they've taken a performance-enhancing drug often show improved strength and endurance even when given a placebo. It affects sleep, as people who believe they got a good night's rest feel more refreshed and perform better even if they were sleep-deprived. It also influences stress and anxiety. If someone takes a fake anxiety-reducing pill, their body might actually relax as if the drug were real. This effect happens because the brain and body respond to expectations. When a person expects improvement, their brain releases chemicals like dopamine and endorphins, which mimic the effects of real medication. In a way, the mind convinces the body that healing is happening. The placebo effect is so strong that many clinical trials struggle to prove that new drugs work better than placebos. Even when patients know they are taking a placebo, studies show that they still experience benefits because the ritual of taking a pill itself creates a psychological response. However, the placebo effect also has a dark side, the nocebo effect. Just as positive expectations can improve health, negative expectations can make things worse. If a patient is told a medication has strong side effects, they might experience those effects even when taking a sugar pill. If a person believes they are allergic to something, they might develop real symptoms, even if there is no actual allergen present. Marketers exploit the placebo effect in everyday life. Expensive products seem better because people expect them to be. Fancy branding, high-end packaging, and exclusive pricing all create the illusion of higher quality, leading people to perceive real differences that don't actually exist. To harness the placebo effect in everyday life, using positive expectations to your advantage increases success. Believing in your ability to improve actually increases the likelihood of success. It's important to be mindful of false beliefs, as assuming something will make you worse can lead the body to respond accordingly. Recognizing when marketing is manipulating perception can also help, as expensive and cheap products often work exactly the same, but the illusion of quality affects judgment. Both the just world hypothesis and the placebo effect reveal how deeply beliefs shape reality. One leads people to see the world as fair, even when it isn't, while the other shows how expectations alone can create real results. Understanding these effects helps build a more accurate perspective on life, allowing for critical thinking, wiser decision-making, and the ability to use the power of belief to one's advantage. The Nocebo Effect. Just as belief in a treatment can create real positive effects, belief in harm can do the opposite. This is the Nocebo Effect, the psychological phenomenon where expecting something negative increases the likelihood that it will actually happen. While the placebo effect tricks the brain into healing, the nocebo effect does the opposite. It convinces the body that something is wrong, triggering real symptoms even when no actual harm is present. This effect is commonly seen in medicine. If a doctor tells a patient that a drug has severe side effects, the patient is more likely to experience them, even if they're only taking a sugar pill. In clinical trials, some participants given harmless placebos report headaches, nausea, or even extreme reactions simply because they expected them. Their belief alone caused a physical response. The nocebo effect is not just limited to medical treatments. It happens in everyday life. If a person is told that they will feel exhausted after a long flight, they are more likely to experience fatigue, even if their body wasn't actually deprived of rest. If someone expects that eating a certain food will make them sick, they might develop nausea just from the thought of it. If a group is told that a room contains a strong allergen, some people will start sneezing or experiencing difficulty breathing, even if the allergen isn't actually present. Fear and anxiety fuel the nocebo effect. When a person constantly worries about getting sick, feeling pain, or experiencing a negative outcome, their brain primes the body to manifest those symptoms. Stress hormones flood the system, increasing sensitivity to pain, reducing immune function, and making even small discomforts feel overwhelming. Marketers and media use the nocebo effect to their advantage. Advertisements often emphasize risks and dangers to make consumers feel vulnerable, convincing them to buy unnecessary products for protection. Skincare ads, for example, highlight the risk of aging or skin damage, making people feel insecure about wrinkles they hadn't even noticed before. News headlines exaggerate health scares, causing some people to experience real symptoms based on fear alone. The best way to counteract the nocebo effect is through awareness and mindset shifts. If you notice yourself feeling worse after reading about a symptom, remind yourself that expectations shape reality. If you hear a negative prediction about an experience, focus on neutral or positive possibilities instead. Understanding that the mind plays a powerful role in physical sensations allows you to take control and avoid unnecessary suffering. The Ostrich Effect. When faced with bad news or uncomfortable truths, people often choose to ignore the problem rather than deal with it. This is the Ostrich Effect, a psychological bias where people avoid negative information to reduce immediate stress, even though avoiding it often makes the situation worse in the long run. The name comes from the myth that ostriches bury their heads in the sand when threatened, hoping the danger will go away. While real ostriches don't actually do this, humans do it all the time. When confronted with financial problems, health concerns, or difficult conversations, many people instinctively look away, convincing themselves that if they don't acknowledge the issue, it doesn't exist. This effect is common in financial behavior. Many people avoid checking their bank accounts when they suspect they've overspent, hoping to escape the stress of seeing a low balance. Investors ignore market downturns, refusing to check their portfolios during financial crashes because they fear facing reality. Avoiding bad news delays action, often leading to greater losses and missed opportunities. Health is another area where the ostrich effect appears frequently. People experiencing symptoms of a potential illness often put off doctor visits, fearing bad news Some ignore warning signs of serious conditions, hoping they will go away on their own. Delaying medical checkups, avoiding test results, or refusing to acknowledge unhealthy habits gives temporary relief, but in the long term, it increases the risk of serious health complications. In relationships, people often avoid difficult conversations because they fear confrontation or discomfort. Ignoring problems in friendships, marriages, or workplaces might feel easier at the moment, but problems don't disappear. They build up. Over time, unresolved issues turn into resentment, breakdowns in communication, or complete relationship failure. The Ostrich Effect also plays a role in global and societal issues. Climate change, economic instability, and political crises are often ignored by those who find the reality too overwhelming. Many prefer to believe everything will work itself out rather than take action, contributing to larger problems that could have been addressed earlier. Overcoming the Ostrich Effect requires facing reality head-on, even when it's uncomfortable. A good strategy is to reframe problems as challenges to solve rather than threats to avoid. Instead of avoiding financial problems, setting up a budget or seeking advice creates a sense of control. Instead of ignoring health concerns, getting a checkup allows for early intervention. Instead of avoiding difficult conversations, addressing issues directly strengthens relationships rather than weakens them. While ignoring bad news might provide temporary comfort, reality always catches up. By choosing to confront challenges sooner rather than later, people give themselves the best chance to fix problems before they spiral out of control. The key to avoiding the Ostrich Effect is recognizing that facing the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, is always better than running from it. Hindsight bias. After something happens, people often convince themselves that they knew it all along, even if they had no real way of predicting the outcome. This is hindsight bias, the psychological illusion that makes past events seem more predictable than they actually were. It distorts memory, giving people the false belief that they saw events coming, when, in reality, they are reconstructing their past thoughts based on what they now know. This bias is why people say things like, "I knew that team was going to win," or "I had a feeling that stock was going to crash." But if they truly knew, they would have made a bet or taken action before the event occurred. Instead, they are experiencing a mental trick where their brain rewrites their memory to align with the present reality. Hindsight bias happens because the brain wants to make sense of the past. After an event has unfolded, it is easier to connect the dots in reverse and see the sequence as logical and inevitable. The randomness and uncertainty that existed before the event disappear in hindsight, making the outcome feel like it was always obvious. This effect can be seen in history, finance, sports, and even personal decisions. After major political events, people claim they always knew what was going to happen, even when predictions were mixed. Investors believe they saw stock market crashes coming, even though they made no moves to protect their money. In relationships, people claim they knew a breakup was bound to happen, even though they were fully invested at the time. Hindsight bias can be dangerous because it creates overconfidence. If people believe they always knew what was going to happen, they become less willing to learn from mistakes. They assume they are better at predicting the future than they actually are, leading to poor decision-making. It also affects how people judge others. When looking at someone else's failure, hindsight bias makes it seem like they should have seen it coming, leading to unfair blame or criticism. To counteract this bias, it helps to recognize that life is unpredictable and outcomes are only obvious in retrospect. Keeping a journal of predictions, writing down actual thoughts before events happen, and acknowledging the role of luck in life can help separate real foresight from the illusion of knowing it all along. Instead of assuming past outcomes were inevitable, it's more accurate to accept that they were just one of many possibilities. The IKEA Effect. People place higher value on things they put effort into creating, even if the final product isn't objectively better. This is the IKEA Effect, named after the Swedish furniture company, where customers are willing to pay more and feel greater attachment to furniture they assemble themselves. The extra effort invested in building the item creates a psychological attachment, making it seem more valuable than a pre-assembled version. This bias isn't just about furniture. It applies to anything people personally invest effort into. A homemade meal is often perceived as tastier than a restaurant dish, even if the ingredients are the same. A project that took hours to complete feels more impressive than something outsourced. A business that someone builds from scratch feels more valuable than an identical one they inherit. The IKEA effect happens because effort creates a sense of ownership. The more time, energy, and labor a person puts into something, the more personal meaning it has. This effect is deeply tied to human psychology. People don't just value the final product, they value their own effort in making it happen. Companies use this effect to increase customer engagement. Build your own meal kits, customizable products, and DIY experiences all make consumers feel more connected to what they create. When people are involved in the process, they appreciate the end result more, even if an expert could have done it faster or better. However, the IKEA effect has downsides. Because people become attached to what they create, they may overvalue their own work and reject criticism. A person who writes a book, designs a product, or starts a project may struggle to accept feedback because their effort blinds them to flaws. This bias also leads to stubbornness. People refuse to abandon ideas or projects, even when evidence suggests they should, simply because they've already invested time into them. The best way to balance the IKEA effect is to recognize that effort does not always equal value. Just because something took a long time to make doesn't mean it is superior. Being open to constructive feedback and understanding that others may not share the same emotional connection to a project can help prevent overattachment. Both hindsight bias and the IKEA effect show how people's perceptions are shaped by their own involvement in events. One makes people believe they predicted the past more accurately than they did, while the other makes them overvalue what they have personally built. Recognizing these biases helps with better decision-making, improved self-awareness, and a clearer view of reality. The curse of knowledge. Once you know something, it becomes almost impossible to imagine what it's like not to know it. This is the curse of knowledge, a cognitive bias that makes it difficult for experts to explain things in a way that beginners can understand. It's why teachers sometimes struggle to simplify complex topics, why experienced professionals assume certain concepts are obvious, and why people often overestimate how well others understand their ideas. This effect happens because knowledge rewires the brain. Once you've learned something, the pathways in your mind change, making that information feel natural and automatic. But because you can't unlearn what you know, you lose perspective on how confusing or unfamiliar it might be to someone without that knowledge. A classic experiment by Elizabeth Newton in 1990 demonstrated this effect. Participants were asked to tap out the rhythm of a well-known song with their fingers, while others tried to guess the song. The tappers assumed their song was obvious, predicting that listeners would guess correctly 50% of the time. In reality, listeners got it right only 2.5% of the time. The reason? The tappers could hear the song in their heads, but the listeners only heard random taps. This highlights the curse of knowledge. Once you know something, in this case, the melody, it's hard to imagine what it's like not to know it. This bias creates communication gaps in many areas of life. Teachers sometimes explain topics in ways that make sense to them but not to their students. Experts in any field, whether it's medicine, finance, or technology, often assume that basic terms and concepts are obvious, leaving non-experts confused. Even in personal relationships, someone who understands a problem deeply might struggle to explain it to a partner or friend who doesn't have the same background. The curse of knowledge also affects leadership and teamwork. Managers sometimes assume that employees understand instructions perfectly, leading to frustration when tasks aren't completed as expected. Programmers might struggle to explain their code to non-technical colleagues, and marketers might fail to connect with customers if they assume too much familiarity with a product. To overcome this bias, empathy is key. Instead of assuming others know what you know, take a step back and ask, if I were hearing this for the first time, what would confuse me? Simplifying language, using analogies, and checking for understanding can help bridge the gap. Great communicators recognize that what's obvious to them is not necessarily obvious to others, and they adjust accordingly. The serial position effect. When given a list of items to remember, people tend to recall the first and last items far better than those in the middle. This is the serial position effect, a memory bias that influences how we process information. This effect is divided into two parts, the primacy effect and the recency effect. The primacy effect explains why people remember the first items in a list more clearly. Since these items appear first, they get more attention and are more likely to be stored in long-term memory. The recency effect, on the other hand, causes people to remember the last items because they are still fresh in short-term memory. A simple example of this bias is trying to memorize a grocery list. If someone quickly reads a list aloud, you are more likely to remember the first few items because they got the most attention, and the last few items because they were the most recent. The items in the middle, they are more likely to be forgotten. This effect has major implications in marketing, education, and public speaking. Advertisers often place the most important messages at the beginning and end of an ad, knowing that viewers are most likely to remember those parts. Teachers structure lessons so that key takeaways are introduced at the start and reinforced at the end. Public speakers and politicians craft speeches carefully, ensuring their strongest points are delivered first and last, making them more memorable. Even in job interviews, the serial position effect plays a role. Interviewers are more likely to remember the first and last candidates more clearly than those in the middle. This is why making a strong first impression and leaving a lasting final impression is critical. This bias also affects how people recall life events. Studies show that when people look back on a vacation, they tend to remember the beginning and the end more vividly, while the middle parts become blurry. Similarly, when reflecting on a relationship, people may focus on the exciting early days and the final breakup, while overlooking the everyday moments in between. To use the serial position effect to your advantage, structure important information strategically. When writing, presenting, or even making a request, put your strongest points first and last to increase their impact. If you're trying to memorize something, focus extra effort on reinforcing the middle information, since that's where memory naturally weakens. Understanding this bias allows you to present ideas in ways that are more likely to stick, whether in conversation, business, or learning. Both the curse of knowledge and the serial position effect reveal how the brain processes information in ways that shape communication and memory. One makes it hard to explain things clearly because you forget what it's like to be a beginner, while the other makes certain moments stand out more than others. Recognizing these effects helps in teaching, learning, public speaking, and everyday interactions, making communication more effective and memorable. The frequency illusion. You learn a new word, and suddenly you hear it everywhere. You start researching a particular car model, and now you see it on every street. You discover a new concept, and it pops up repeatedly in conversations, books, and social media. This is the frequency illusion, a cognitive bias where once you become aware of something, your brain begins noticing it more often, making it seem like it has suddenly become more common, when in reality, it was always there. This effect is caused by two mental processes: selective attention and confirmation bias. Selective attention happens when your brain filters out unnecessary information and highlights things that are relevant to you. If you've recently learned about a certain topic, your brain subconsciously scans for it, bringing it to the forefront of your awareness. Confirmation bias strengthens this effect by making you interpret these repeated sightings as proof that the thing has actually become more frequent, even though you're simply noticing it more. The frequency illusion is not a real change in the world, it's a change in your perception. That new slang word you just picked up? People were saying it before, but your brain wasn't paying attention. That book everyone seems to be reading? It was always there, but now it stands out to you. That number sequence that keeps appearing? Your mind is filtering out everything else and focusing only on what seems significant. This effect is heavily exploited in marketing and advertising. Once you see an ad for a product, your brain begins to notice it everywhere, on social media, in stores, even in conversations. It feels like everyone is suddenly talking about it, making you more likely to believe it's trending or more popular than it actually is. Political campaigns use the same strategy. Once a certain issue is highlighted, people start seeing evidence of it all around them, even if it's not more prevalent than before. The frequency illusion also plays a role in personal beliefs. If someone believes that people are rude, they will start noticing every instance of rudeness around them, reinforcing their belief. If someone thinks that opportunities are everywhere, they will start recognizing more possibilities, even if the actual number hasn't changed. This shows how your focus shapes your reality. What you pay attention to becomes more visible, even if the external world remains the same. Understanding the frequency illusion helps prevent false assumptions about reality. Instead of assuming something has suddenly become more common, take a step back and ask, has this really increased, or am I just noticing it more? This awareness allows you to think more critically and avoid overestimating trends or coincidences. The McGurk Effect. What you see can completely change what you hear. This is the McGurk Effect, a mind-bending illusion where visual and auditory information clash, causing the brain to alter perception based on what the eyes see rather than what the ears hear. Discovered by psychologist Harry McGurk in the 1970s, this effect is best demonstrated in a simple experiment. If you listen to a recording of someone saying ba ba ba, and then watch a video of them saying fa fa fa, your brain overrides the sound and hears fa fa fa, even though the audio remains unchanged. Your eyes trick your ears. What you see affects what you think you're hearing. This happens because the brain processes sensory information together, not separately. It relies on multiple cues to interpret the world, meaning that visual input can override auditory perception. In everyday conversations, people naturally read lip movements, facial expressions, and body language to understand speech. But when those visual cues don't match the actual sound, the brain tries to reconcile the conflict, often leading to distorted perception. The McGurk Effect is not just a laboratory trick. It happens constantly in real life. In noisy environments, your brain uses visual context to fill in missing sounds. This is why watching someone's mouth move makes it easier to understand them in a loud setting. Subtitles in movies can also change what you think you're hearing. If the words on screen don't match the spoken dialogue, your perception of the speech may shift. This effect has important implications for communication and language learning. It explains why people who rely on lip reading, such as the hearing impaired, may experience distortions when audio and visual signals don't match. It also shows why face-to-face communication is often clearer than phone conversations, where visual cues are absent. The McGurk Effect also highlights how the brain is not a passive receiver of reality. It actively constructs perception. What you experience is not just the raw data from your senses, but a combination of inputs that your mind interprets based on patterns, context, and expectations. Understanding this effect can help improve awareness of how perception works. If you ever find yourself mishearing something, ask yourself, is my brain being influenced by what I see? Recognizing that your senses can deceive you makes you more aware of how subjective perception really is. Both the frequency illusion and the McGurk effect reveal how our brains filter and reinterpret reality. One makes us notice things more often after learning about them, while the other blends visual and auditory information, changing what we think we hear. These cognitive biases show that perception is not just about what is truly out there. It's about how the brain organizes and interprets the world. The Barnum Effect. People are naturally drawn to vague, general statements that feel deeply personal, even when they could apply to almost anyone. This is the Barnum Effect, a psychological bias where individuals interpret broad, non-specific descriptions as uniquely accurate reflections of themselves. This effect explains why horoscopes, personality tests, fortune tellers, and even vague compliments can feel eerily precise, even though they are written to be applicable to almost anyone. The name comes from P.T. Barnum, the famous showman and circus promoter who was known for saying, "There's a sucker born every minute." He understood that people are eager to believe personalized truths about themselves, even when they are generic. This effect was first studied by psychologist Bertram Forer in 1948. He gave his students a fake personality test and then handed them all the same personality analysis filled with vague generic statements like, "You sometimes have doubts about whether you made the right decision," and "You prefer to be liked but can also be critical of yourself." The students were asked to rate how accurately the description fit them. On average, they rated it 4.3 out of 5 for accuracy, even though every single one of them had received the exact same description. The Barnum effect works because people are hungry for self-knowledge. When someone reads a horoscope, a fortune cookie, or a vague personality analysis, their brain fills in the gaps, making it feel uniquely accurate. They remember the parts that fit and ignore the parts that don't. This is also why cold reading, the technique used by psychics and fortune tellers, can feel so convincing. They throw out broad, general statements, and the person being read interprets them in a way that makes them feel personal. Marketing and advertising heavily exploit this effect. When companies use broad yet flattering descriptions, customers feel understood and are more likely to trust the brand. Personality-based quizzes on social media, such as "What kind of leader are you?" or "Which celebrity matches your personality?" use this trick to engage users and collect data, making them feel as if they are uncovering something profound about themselves. Understanding the Barnum effect helps develop critical thinking skills. The next time a horoscope, fortune, or personality test feels shockingly accurate, ask yourself, could this apply to almost anyone? By recognizing this effect, you can avoid falling for vague statements and focus on real, evidence-based insights about yourself. The self-fulfilling prophecy. What you believe about yourself and the world can actually shape reality. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy, a psychological phenomenon where expectations influence behavior in a way that makes the expectation come true. When you believe something will happen, consciously or unconsciously, you start acting in ways that increase the likelihood of it actually happening. This effect was famously demonstrated by psychologist Robert Rosenthal in an experiment involving teachers and students. He told teachers that certain students in their class had been identified as academic bloomers who were expected to show great progress, though, in reality, these students were chosen randomly. By the end of the school year, these students performed significantly better than their peers. The reason? The teachers subtly changed their behavior, giving these students more encouragement, more attention, and higher expectations, which led to improved performance. The students, in turn, internalized these expectations and put in more effort, proving the teachers right, even though the selection was completely random. This effect works in many areas of life. If someone believes they are bad at math, they might approach it with low confidence, put in less effort, and eventually perform poorly, confirming their original belief. If someone believes they are charismatic and likable, they will act with confidence, making others respond positively, reinforcing their belief. The self-fulfilling prophecy also plays a role in relationships. If a person believes their partner is going to leave them, they might become overly insecure, controlling, or distant, pushing their partner away and ultimately causing the breakup they feared. On the other hand, someone who believes a relationship will thrive will behave in ways that strengthen the bond, making it more likely to last. This effect extends to health, career, and even social status. Studies show that patients who believe they will recover from an illness tend to heal faster, while those who fear the worst often experience worse health outcomes due to stress and negative mental states. In the workplace, employees who expect to succeed work harder, take more risks, and project confidence, leading to actual success. Meanwhile, those who believe they will fail may avoid challenges, leading to stagnation or underperformance. One of the most dangerous aspects of the self-fulfilling prophecy is its ability to reinforce negative cycles. If a person is labeled as lazy or troublemaking, whether in school, work, or social settings, they might begin to internalize that identity and behave in ways that make the label come true. Societal stereotypes function in the same way. When a group is repeatedly told they are less capable or less intelligent, those messages affect confidence and ambition, creating barriers to achievement. However, this effect can also be harnessed for personal growth. By consciously shaping positive expectations, people can influence their own behavior and outcomes. Developing a growth mindset, where challenges are seen as opportunities to improve rather than proof of failure, creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where effort and persistence lead to real success. Recognizing this effect helps in breaking negative patterns and creating positive ones. If you believe something bad is inevitable, question whether your actions are contributing to making it true. If you want to change an outcome, start by changing your expectations and behaviors to align with the reality you want to create. Both the Barnum Effect and the self-fulfilling prophecy reveal how beliefs shape perception and reality. One makes people believe vague statements are uniquely personal, while the other turns expectations into lived experiences. Understanding these effects allows for greater awareness, critical thinking, and control over one's own mindset and actions. The contrast principle. How something is perceived depends not just on its own qualities, but on what it is compared to. This is the contrast principle, a psychological effect where people judge things as better or worse based on what came before them rather than on their absolute value. This bias influences decision-making, perception, and even emotions. If you lift a lightweight object after holding something heavy, the light object will feel even lighter than it actually is. If you see a $2,000 designer jacket before seeing a $300 jacket, the second one suddenly feels like a bargain, even though it's still expensive. If you eat a mediocre meal after having terrible food, the mediocre meal will seem amazing by comparison. Marketers and salespeople exploit the contrast principle all the time. When selling expensive products, they show customers the highest priced item first. Once the brain has anchored onto a high price, everything else seems more reasonable in comparison. A realtor might show a rundown, overpriced house first, so that the next house, while still expensive, feels like a great deal. High-end restaurants put overpriced items on the menu, knowing that everything else will feel affordable by contrast. This principle also affects attractiveness and social judgment. Someone who walks into a room after a supermodel may seem less attractive than they would on their own, while an average-looking person surrounded by less attractive people will seem more attractive than usual. In job interviews, a strong candidate looks even stronger if they follow a weak applicant, and a speaker at an event will seem more impressive if they follow someone boring. The contrast principle is why expectations matter. If you expect an experience to be bad and it turns out okay, it will feel better than expected. If you expect something amazing but it turns out okay, it feels like a disappointment. This is why people often adjust their expectations in life. When they brace for something bad, they set themselves up for a pleasant surprise. To use this principle to your advantage, control what you compare things to. Instead of comparing your current success to someone far ahead, compare it to where you started. Instead of feeling like your home is small after seeing a mansion, compare it to places with less space. Recognizing how comparisons shape perception helps avoid unnecessary dissatisfaction and allows you to see things more objectively. Repetition persuasion. The more often people hear something, the more likely they are to believe it, whether it's true or not. This is repetition persuasion, a psychological effect where repeated exposure to a statement makes it seem more credible, even when there is no actual evidence to support it. This happens because the brain prefers familiarity. When information is repeated, it becomes easier to process, and the brain mistakes ease for truth. The first time you hear something, it might seem questionable, but by the 5th or 10th time, it starts to feel like common knowledge. Politicians, advertisers, and media outlets use repetition to influence public opinion. Political slogans are repeated endlessly. Make America great again. Yes, we can. Stronger together. Because repetition makes them stick in people's minds. Advertisers repeat brand names, jingles, and slogans, knowing that even if people don't consciously believe the message at first, repeated exposure subtly changes perception. This effect is especially dangerous when it comes to misinformation and propaganda. False statements, if repeated often enough, can begin to feel true, not because they are supported by facts, but because they become familiar. This is why conspiracy theories, fake news, and misleading statistics spread so easily. People often assume that if they have heard something multiple times, it must be true. Social interactions also reveal repetition persuasion. If someone repeats a false rumor about a person, it starts to shape how others see them, even if no real evidence exists. If an individual repeats negative self-talk like, "I'm not good enough," their brain starts to internalize it, reinforcing self-doubt. Conversely, repeating positive affirmations like, "I am capable and strong," can rewire the brain's belief system. To defend against repetition persuasion, always question information, even if you've heard it multiple times. Ask, is this true, or has it just been repeated so often that it feels true? Fact-check sources, avoid being swayed by familiarity alone, and be mindful of how repetition shapes your own beliefs, whether in media, marketing, or your personal mindset. Both the contrast principle and repetition persuasion show how context and exposure influence perception. One distorts how we judge things based on what they are compared to, while the other alters belief through sheer repetition. Understanding these effects allows you to think more critically, resist manipulation, and make clearer, more rational decisions. The fear-then-relief technique. Fear is a powerful motivator, and when people experience a sudden sense of relief after fear, they become significantly more compliant and suggestible. This is the fear-then-relief technique, a psychological manipulation tactic where inducing fear or anxiety is followed by a comforting resolution, making the individual more likely to agree to requests or follow instructions. This method works by disrupting normal thought patterns. When people are afraid, their brains focus entirely on the perceived danger, entering a fight-or-flight state. Once relief follows, whether through reassurance, a solution, or a distraction, the brain relaxes, causing a psychological drop in resistance. This moment of vulnerability makes individuals more susceptible to persuasion. One classic example is scam emails that claim, "Your bank account has been compromised." After creating panic, the email offers an immediate solution. Click this link to restore your account. In their state of fear, the recipient is less likely to think critically and more likely to comply without questioning. Sales and marketing also exploit this technique. A company might warn customers about serious risks, such as identity theft, home security threats, or hidden health dangers, only to immediately present their product as the solution. Infomercials do this constantly. First, they highlight how terrible life is without their product, then offer a simple, stress-relieving solution, making customers eager to buy. This effect is frequently used in law enforcement, politics, and social control. Authorities may present a looming crisis, then introduce a policy or law as the only way to avoid disaster. Governments have historically used this method to justify war, surveillance programs, or emergency restrictions, making the public more willing to sacrifice freedoms in exchange for perceived safety. Even in everyday life, this technique can be found in negotiation and persuasion. A boss might first criticize an employee's performance, but then quickly reassure them, saying, "But I believe in you. If you work extra hours, I know you can turn this around." The fear of losing their job followed by relief makes the employee more likely to comply with the request. To defend against the fear then relief technique, pause before reacting when fear is triggered. Ask yourself, is this fear justified? Is the offered solution actually in my best interest? Recognizing when fear is being used as a manipulation tool allows you to remain calm, rational, and in control of your decisions. The sleeper effect. Not all persuasive messages are immediately effective. Some arguments, even if they seem weak or unconvincing at first, can gain influence over time, especially if they are repeated enough. This is the sleeper effect, a psychological phenomenon where information that was initially dismissed or considered unreliable becomes more persuasive as time passes. This effect occurs because people forget the source of information faster than the message itself. When individuals hear a weak argument, they may reject it at first, especially if it comes from an untrustworthy source. However, over time, they forget where they heard it, but remember the message, making them more likely to believe it later. The sleeper effect explains why misinformation spreads. Even if people initially recognize a false claim as unreliable, constant exposure over time makes it stick in their subconscious. Eventually, when they recall the information later, they fail to remember it was originally discredited, leading them to accept it as fact. This effect is heavily exploited in propaganda, marketing, and media manipulation. Advertisers might present a bold, questionable claim, knowing that while it might seem exaggerated or misleading at first, repeated exposure over time will normalize the message. Political campaigns also use this tactic, spreading half-truths or emotionally charged statements, knowing that even if people dismiss them at first, the message will linger in their minds and influence future opinions. Research has shown that negative political ads, even those proven false, tend to have a lasting impact because voters often remember the criticism but forget the rebuttal. This is why politicians frequently use misleading attacks, repeating false claims until they become accepted as truth. The sleeper effect also influences social stereotypes. Ideas that are introduced in movies, music, or cultural conversations may not seem convincing immediately, but over time, they shape societal attitudes. This is how persistent messages, whether about gender roles, beauty standards, or success, become ingrained in people's beliefs even if they were initially met with skepticism. To protect yourself from the sleeper effect, always consider the source of information. If you hear something controversial or questionable, actively remind yourself where it came from before accepting it. Fact-checking and re-evaluating old beliefs can help prevent weak arguments from becoming deeply ingrained truths. Both the fear-then-relief technique and the sleeper effect show how psychological manipulation can shape people's decisions and beliefs over time. One creates immediate compliance through emotional shock, while the other slowly builds persuasion by making ideas seem more credible with repetition. Recognizing these effects allows for better critical thinking, stronger resistance to manipulation, and greater control over personal beliefs. Priming effect. People like to think their decisions are based on logic and conscious thought, but in reality, subtle cues influence choices in ways they don't even notice. This is the priming effect, a psychological phenomenon where exposure to certain words, images, or experiences unconsciously shapes behavior, thoughts, and decisions later on. Priming happens because the brain constantly makes associations. If you see the word yellow, your brain will process banana faster because those concepts are linked in memory. If you hear calming music in a store, you're more likely to browse longer and spend more. If you're exposed to words like polite and patient, you may unknowingly become more polite in a conversation shortly afterward. This effect is heavily used in advertising and marketing. Restaurants play slow music to make diners stay longer and order more. Luxury brands use elegant imagery and classical music to prime customers into associating their products with status and sophistication. Supermarkets place fresh flowers and baked goods near the entrance to create a welcoming atmosphere, priming shoppers to feel good and spend more. Priming also influences judgment and behavior. Studies have shown that if people are asked to think about old age, they unconsciously walk more slowly afterward. If they are exposed to words associated with rudeness, they are more likely to interrupt conversations. Even colors have an effect. Seeing the color red can prime feelings of urgency or caution, while blue tones are associated with calmness and trust. News and media also prime people's perceptions. If the news repeatedly highlights crime stories, people may overestimate the danger in their surroundings, even if crime rates are stable. If a person watches a movie about betrayal, they may feel more suspicious in their own relationships without realizing why. The priming effect is especially powerful in memory and learning. If a teacher introduces a concept using positive framing, students are more likely to engage with it enthusiastically. If someone is primed with negative expectations, such as hearing that a task is difficult, they may perform worse simply because they were mentally prepared for struggle. To use the priming effect to your advantage, surround yourself with cues that reinforce positive behaviors. If you want to feel more productive, place motivational quotes in your workspace. If you want to eat healthier, keep fruit visible and snacks out of sight. If you want to feel confident, read success stories before tackling a challenge. To avoid being unconsciously influenced, become aware of how environments, media, and conversations are priming your thoughts. Noticing these subtle influences allows you to make more conscious decisions rather than reacting automatically to your surroundings. The peak end rule. People do not judge experiences based on their entire duration. Instead, they evaluate them based on the most intense moment, the peak, and how they ended, the end, while ignoring everything in between. This is the peak end rule, a cognitive bias that distorts how memories of events are formed. This effect was discovered by psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who found that people's lasting impression of an experience depends less on its overall quality and more on the peak and the ending. Even if an experience was mostly positive or mostly negative, what sticks in memory is the most extreme moment and how it concluded. This is why vacations, relationships, movies, and even medical procedures are remembered differently than they were actually lived. If a vacation was uneventful but had one breathtaking moment, like watching a sunset from a mountain, that single moment defines the whole trip in memory. If a relationship was long and stable but ended with a dramatic breakup, the entire relationship may be remembered as painful, despite years of happiness. If a movie is slow for 2 hours but has an amazing climax, people will leave the theater thinking it was great. The peak end rule is often used in customer service and business. Smart companies design experiences so that the peak moment is thrilling and the ending is satisfying. This is why amusement parks place their most exciting ride in the middle and offer fireworks or entertainment at the exit, so visitors leave with a strong, positive impression. Restaurants serve a free dessert or mint at the end of a meal, knowing that the final moments influence how the entire experience is remembered. This effect also applies to pain and discomfort. Studies found that patients undergoing a painful procedure but experiencing a less painful ending reported the experience as less painful overall than those whose discomfort ended suddenly. The key takeaway? A gradual, less painful ending makes an experience more tolerable in memory. Understanding the peak end rule allows for better decision-making and experience design. If you want to make a lasting impression, create a strong peak moment and ensure a satisfying ending. If you're planning an event, make sure the highlight is powerful and the conclusion is enjoyable. If you're trying to end something difficult, a job, a relationship, a difficult project, try to end on a positive note, because that's how it will be remembered. Being aware of the peak end rule also helps avoid memory distortions. Instead of letting one extreme moment define an entire experience, take a step back and evaluate it as a whole. Was the relationship really terrible? Or are you just focusing on the last fight? Was the vacation boring? Or are you forgetting all the smaller, enjoyable moments? Both the priming effect and the peak end rule show how memory and perception are shaped by unconscious influences. One subtly directs behavior based on prior exposure, while the other distorts how events are remembered by focusing on select moments. Recognizing these effects allows for more mindful decision-making, better communication, and the ability to shape experiences intentionally rather than being unknowingly controlled by them. The status quo bias. People tend to resist change, even when a better option is available. This is the status quo bias, a psychological tendency where individuals prefer to keep things the way they are rather than making changes, even when change could improve their situation. This bias exists because the brain prefers familiarity and predictability. Change requires effort, risk, and uncertainty, which can feel uncomfortable. Even if logic suggests that switching jobs, trying a new habit, or making a financial move would be beneficial, people often default to inaction simply because the current situation feels safer and easier. One study showed that when employees were automatically enrolled in retirement savings plans, they rarely opted out, even if they had previously failed to enroll themselves. This highlights how sticking with the status quo is often easier than making an active choice, even when the choice is beneficial. Status quo bias also affects consumer behavior. Many people stick with the same brand of products for years, not necessarily because it's the best, but because they are used to it. In relationships, individuals may stay in unsatisfying situations simply because leaving seems too difficult or because they fear the unknown. Marketers and companies take advantage of this bias by making their product or service the default option. For example, Subscription services use automatic renewals, knowing that customers are more likely to keep paying rather than go through the effort of canceling. Companies rely on the fact that people will stick with what they already have, even if it's not the best deal. Status quo bias can be problematic when it prevents personal growth and progress. It makes people resist learning new skills, improving their health, or exploring better opportunities. It also explains why many organizations struggle with innovation. Employees may resist new processes, even if they are clearly more efficient. To overcome this bias, it's important to reframe change as an opportunity rather than a threat. Instead of fearing the unknown, ask, is the current situation really the best option, or am I just avoiding change? Small, calculated risks can lead to major improvements, but only if people challenge their instinct to stay where they are. Default bias. People are more likely to stick with pre-selected options than make an active choice, even when an alternative might be better. This is the default bias, a cognitive bias where individuals prefer to accept the default setting rather than actively changing something, even when doing so requires minimal effort. This bias works because making decisions requires mental energy. Choosing something new means weighing options, analyzing risks, and putting in effort. Since the brain prefers efficiency, it often defaults to not making a decision at all, leading people to accept whatever option is already in place. One of the most famous studies on default bias involved organ donation rates in different countries. In countries where citizens were automatically enrolled as organ donors, with the option to opt out, donation rates were over 90%. But in countries where people had to actively opt in, donation rates were as low as 15%. The difference wasn't because people had strong opinions about organ donation. It was because most people stick with whatever option is pre-selected. Businesses, governments, and technology companies intentionally design defaults to influence behavior. Social media platforms default users into accepting data tracking, knowing that few will take the time to adjust privacy settings. Streaming services automatically renew subscriptions because they know users won't cancel unless they actively decide to. Employers enroll workers in benefits programs by default, increasing participation rates simply because opting out requires extra steps. Default bias affects everyday decision-making as well. Many people never change their phone's factory settings, stick with preset app permissions, or continue using the same financial plans or insurance policies year after year without reviewing them. People also eat whatever portions are served, rely on default recommendations, and even keep using outdated software simply because changing it feels like unnecessary work. While default bias can sometimes be beneficial, like when it helps people save for retirement or adopt healthy habits, it can also lead to missed opportunities. Many people stick with bad financial plans, unnecessary subscriptions, or outdated routines simply because they never actively choose something better. The best way to counter default bias is to pause and review default choices. Instead of automatically accepting what's given, ask, is this actually the best option for me, or is it just the easiest one? Making small, intentional decisions like adjusting settings, reviewing subscriptions, or actively selecting the best option can lead to better financial, personal, and professional outcomes. Both status quo bias and default bias reveal how people tend to resist change, even when making a switch would be beneficial. One makes people cling to familiarity, while the other makes them stick with pre-selected options simply because it's easier. Recognizing these biases allows for more intentional decision-making, smarter choices, and greater control over life's direction rather than simply accepting whatever is handed to you. The Reciprocity Principle. When someone does something for you, you feel compelled to return the favor. This is the Reciprocity Principle, a psychological tendency where people naturally feel obligated to repay kindness, favors, or gestures, even when they didn't ask for them. This bias is deeply rooted in human evolution and social bonding. In ancient societies, sharing resources and helping others increased survival chances. The expectation was simple. If someone helped you today, you would help them later. Over time, this turned into an automatic social norm, making people uncomfortable with feeling indebted to others. The Reciprocity Principle is one of the most powerful tools in persuasion, sales, and negotiation. Businesses use this trick by offering free samples, trials, or small gifts, knowing that many customers will feel obligated to buy something in return. When a waiter gives extra mints or writes a personal thank you on the check, diners tip more. When charities send free address labels or gifts in the mail, donation rates increase dramatically, even among people who had no prior intention of donating. This principle also explains why favor exchanges shape relationships. If a friend helps you move, you'll feel obligated to help them when they ask. If a coworker covers your shift, you'll be more likely to cover theirs later. In dating and social interactions, people who give small acts of kindness, like compliments, gestures, or assistance, are perceived as more likable, and the receiver often feels compelled to reciprocate that kindness. However, reciprocity can be manipulated. Some people exploit this bias by giving small, calculated favors just to get something bigger in return. This is why high-pressure salespeople offer free perks, why scammers try to give gifts before making a request, and why some people use guilt to extract favors from others. To use the reciprocity principle wisely, give without expecting anything in return, but also recognize when someone is using it to manipulate you. If you feel pressured into returning a favor that wasn't truly generous, remind yourself that you don't owe anyone beyond what feels fair to you. Reciprocity should be a tool for genuine connection, not obligation. The false memory effect. People believe their memories are perfect recordings of the past, but in reality, memories are highly malleable and unreliable. This is the false memory effect, a psychological phenomenon where people can be convinced they remember something that never actually happened. The brain doesn't store memories like a camera or hard drive. Instead, it reconstructs them each time they are recalled. Every time you remember an event, your brain fills in missing details based on expectations, emotions, and outside influences, which means that over time, memories can become distorted or even completely fabricated. False memories can be created by suggestions, leading questions, or misinformation. A classic study by psychologist Elizabeth Loftus showed that when people were asked leading questions about a car accident, e.g., how fast was the car going when it smashed into the other vehicle, versus how fast was the car going when it hit the other vehicle, their memories changed based on the wording. Those who heard smashed remembered the cars moving faster and more violently, even though they saw the same footage as the others. This effect is why eyewitness testimonies are unreliable. If a witness is exposed to misleading information, such as hearing other people describe the event inaccurately, they may unknowingly adopt those false details as their own memories. This has led to wrongful convictions in legal cases, as confident but mistaken witnesses have testified about things that never actually happened. False memories can also develop in personal relationships and childhood experiences. If a person repeatedly hears stories about how clumsy they were as a kid, they may start to believe they remember specific embarrassing moments, even if they never happened. Families sometimes collectively misremember events where a false story is reinforced over time and becomes accepted as truth. The media plays a huge role in shaping false memories. After major events, news outlets and social media often circulate exaggerated or misleading narratives. Over time, people who are exposed to these narratives may believe they personally remember things that never occurred, simply because they heard about them repeatedly. One famous example is the Mandela Effect, where large groups of people share the same false memory. Some people swear they remember the Monopoly man having a monocle, he never did, or that the children's book series was called The Berenstain Bears, when it was actually The Berenstain Bears. These false memories are likely caused by similar associations in the brain rather than actual past experiences. To protect yourself from the false memory effect, always question details that feel fuzzy or too perfect. If a memory seems unusually clear but lacks specific proof, consider the possibility that it has been influenced by external sources. Keeping written records, photos, and factual evidence can help distinguish genuine memories from reconstructed ones. Both the Reciprocity Principle and the false memory effect reveal how the mind is influenced by social expectations and cognitive distortions. One shapes behavior through the obligation to return favors, while the other alters reality by convincing people they remember things that never happened. Understanding these biases helps maintain stronger personal boundaries and a more accurate perception of reality.